What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-Sensei here with What If Mark Grayson Was Born in DC x Invincible Universe? DC/Invincible Crossover. Part 2. If you enjoy this type of content, please super smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of Invincible without further ado. Watchtower. 1 month later. The mood was solemn as Clark walked through the corridors of the satellite base of the Justice League. He had felt a pit in his stomach form ever since the fight he had with Mark. The way he lost control like that and killed the boy had kept him up at night and distracted him during the day. He didn't know how he had let it get that far. Sure, he was angry at what had happened to Kara, but he'd never gone that far before. What hurt him the most was the look Kara gave him when she found out what he had done. After beating him senseless, she looked at him and said that she never wanted to see his face again. Even Starfire, who he had never seen mad before, looked angry at him. Though he couldn't blame them at all. If not for Bruce, he would have gone straight to the police station and turned himself in for murder. He wasn't sure why Bruce insisted he not do anything yet. Out of all of them, he adhered to the no-killing rule the most. Clark turned a corner and ended up bumping into someone. It wasn't hard to know who it was, as very few women nearly reached his height. Diana Dash. But before he could finish, she pushed past him and walked away, ignoring anything he had to say. Clark sighed but continued walking. Most of the Justice League had been a bit cold to him as of late, but none more so than Diana. It seemed that Mark had saved her life at some point, though she didn't go into details. It made the weight of Clark's guilt grow heavier, as Mark was never a bad kid, he just happened to be the son of a dangerous man. Clark cleared his thoughts as he entered the high-security area of the Watchtower. Bruce had insisted they install a prison on the ship for those too dangerous to be left on Earth. He also wished for it to be capable of containing Clark himself. They did end up using it, so maybe Bruce's paranoia was warranted. Clark walked deeper and deeper until he came to the last door on the corridor. Putting his hand on a scanner, it opened, and inside was a large cell that held only one prisoner. Sitting on his bed reading a book was none other than Nolan Grayson, the ex-hero known as Omni-Man. As Clark entered, Nolan looked up from his book before looking back down again, quickly losing interest in the Kryptonian. "I have something I need to tell you," Clark said as he walked close to the glass window. However, Nolan did not reply and kept on reading. "Your son manifested his powers recently. In our efforts to secure him, there were complications," Clark stated. At the mention of his son, Nolan put down his book and started listening to what Clark was saying. "I fought him, and I lost control and ended up killing him," Clark said regretfully as he looked down at the floor. "How?" That was the only thing Nolan uttered. As a matter of fact, it was the first thing he had said since he was captured. "I impaled him through the stomach and threw him into the sea," Clark stated bluntly, refusing to hide any of the details as Bruce had suggested. He expected a lot of things: for Nolan to curse him, to try and attack him, or maybe even to cry. What he did not expect was for him to start to chuckle, and for that chuckle to break into full-on laughter. "Perhaps it should be you in this cell," Nolan said before picking up his book and going back to reading. Clark clenched his fists, but didn't say anything because a small part of himself agreed with him. The last thing Mark remembered was that he was drowning. He tried to hold his breathing, but he couldn't. He couldn't move either, and he just slowly sank into the abyss, unable to call for help as his voice had disappeared. Gasp. He opened his eyes and started greedily gulping in air as if he hadn't breathed for years. The last thing he remembered was being impaled by Superman, and then being thrown into the ocean. He looked around and saw he was in what appeared to be a large studio flat, though the furniture was pretty bare. He tried to move but found he couldn't. He looked down and saw his stomach was bandaged up, but there was a small indentation. He could still feel his body, so he must have healed, though how he healed from that he had no idea. "Hey Ivy. Why boy toys up?" he heard someone shout in a very exaggerated Brooklyn accent. He managed to find the strength to turn his head just in time to see a pale woman with blonde hair in twin tails slam herself on the bed. Each of her tails had blue and red at the tip, and she wore some sort of clown makeup. "Oh damn me," Mark thought to himself as he realized who she was. "Hiya there. I'm Dr. Harleen Quinzel, and I'm here to check your temperature," she said cheerfully as she held up a comically large thermometer. "Now turn around," she said in a much more aggressive manner, making Mark's eyes widen. "Leave him alone, Harley. Swampy wants us to look after him, and I don't want to make him mad," Poison Ivy said as she followed Harley in from where she came. "Ah, come on, he could end up enjoying it," I mean, why would he have a pleasure button up there if you weren't meant to boop it? Harley said with a sad look on her face. Please don't boop my butt, Mark struggled to say. Poison Ivy looked at Mark and sat down next to him. How are you feeling? She asked. 'Cause you look like crap. Harley added with a quick nod of her head. I have a freaking hole in my stomach, Mark breathed out in frustration. Harley leaned forward, crawling towards him on the bed. Had circumstances been different, Mark might have enjoyed the eyeful he got when she bent over, but he had a hole in his stomach, and thus was Harley Quinn. He. That's pretty gross, Harley said as she peeked under his bandages. She kept poking her finger through it while giggling to herself. Swampy said you should heal, but it is hard to believe when your guts are nearly pouring out, Ivy said as she started poking into his hole as well. Please stop poking my hole, Mark asked, though while Ivy obliged, Harley kept on doing it as if she hadn't heard him. How long till I'm up again? Mark asked. Poison Ivy snorted. How the hell should I know? If you hadn't woken up I would have dumped your body out back, she said with a laugh. I am injured, and to look after me I have 2 useless doctors, Mark said with a humorless laugh. Poison Ivy smiled sheepishly. Actually, I am gonna be pretty busy at my new house, so. She looked to Harley, who was still giggling while playing with his hole. Mark looked at Ivy with widened eyes, and no. He said disbelievingly, she wouldn't actually do that, would she? He thought to himself, but when he saw her face he realized it wasn't a bluff. I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of my best friend Harley, she said with a smile, though it was clearly a smile at his expense. Please don't leave me alone with her, Mark pleaded, but it seemed Ivy didn't hear him, or more likely she chose to ignore him. Harley, I'm going to be away for a while, make sure to take good care of Mark here, she said sternly to her. Harley looked up from Mark's wound and smiled manically. Oh, don't you worry, me and Marky will be best buddies in a few weeks, just you wait and see, she said, clapping him on the stomach just above his hole. Superman killed me. There is no way my luck could be this bad that I have to live with an absolute psycho, Mark thought to himself as he grunted from the pain of her slapping him. Either she was a lot stronger than she seemed or his powers were out of whack, which made the thought of living with her a little worse. See. It'll be fine. Now please excuse me, but I have to go and fix up my new house since meat heat over here made a massive hole in it, Ivy said as she pointed at me. Wait, does she mean my house? Mark thought to himself. He was about to start shouting, but he ended up coughing his guts up. His vision started to blur, and he quickly ended up passing out. When he came to, he saw Harley, who was sitting by the bed with a frown on her face. There was 4 drips sticking out of his arm, confirming his suspicion that his invulnerability wasn't working. Maybe cause his body was working overtime to keep his organs in his body. Marky, I have bad news, Harley said in an uncharacteristically serious voice. Mark frowned as he looked at her. He still couldn't move much without pain, but he managed to shift himself so he was leant up slightly. What do you mean? He asked with slight concern. I didn't understand before, but when they started playing that tape on the news of Superman impaling you, it made sense, Harley said as she put a hand on his own. Mark scrunched his eyebrows and considered moving his hand, but he didn't have the strength to. Harley, get to the point, he said a little bit snappily. Harley then looked over to his wound. Superman is an alien. No one really knows how they reproduce, but now we do, she replied. Squeak. Mark frowned and looked down. What the hell? He shouted as he saw this fish-like silence start to push out of his hole and through his bandages get it out. He shouted as he tried to move his arms, but he didn't have the strength to do so. Congratulations, Mama, Harley shouted as she hugged him. This can't be happening. Harley, get it off me, Mark shouted as he wiggled around. Harley just sat back in her chair, though she couldn't control herself anymore. She started to laugh uncontrollably, only making the situation worse for Mark. Harley, Mark shouted. Oh, calm down, it's only a toy, she said with an amused expression on her face as she raised her arm. As she did, the alien came out of him, and Mark saw the glint of light reflecting off a thin piece of string. He calmed down but couldn't help but be annoyed at her little prank. Hee, you should have seen the look on your face. Thinkin' Superman was your baby daddy, she said as she started laughing again. All right, I can't keep this in any longer, Mark thought to himself. Mark and Kara's house. Kara lay curled up on the bed that she and Mark used to share. With her was Corey, who had not left her side for a single moment. She spooned the Kryptonian from behind as she comforted her. When she saw the video of Mark being impaled from behind by none other than her cousin, it felt like her whole world came falling. Everything was so perfect before, she thought to herself as tears started to fall from her eyes again, which surprised her. She'd cried so much this month that she'd thought there wasn't anything left. Her only comfort had been Corey and the baby. Her stomach had started to swell slightly, and while it brought her untold amounts of happiness, she couldn't help but feel sad knowing her baby would never know who her father was. All because of the damn Justice League, she thought to herself. While she knew it was mostly the hormones talking, she wanted to burn Martian Manhunter alive with her heat vision and toss Batman into space. If it wasn't for Corey, she would have beat her cousin even worse than she had. She just didn't understand why Kal had done such a thing. He had always kept villains alive before. Lex Luthor was still alive, and yet he killed Mark. She just didn't understand why. "Friend Kara, it is past noon. Maybe we should get up. I believe both of us could use some solar radiation," Corey said as she stroked her hair. Kara just turned around and buried her head into Corey's chest. "I don't feel like getting up," she mumbled. Corey looked down at her friend with concern. She knew situations like this were hard to work out, and she didn't want to fail again like she did with Raven. Even thinking of Raven filled her with such sadness. She wished she could have helped her so she didn't have to leave. However, they were both brought out of their thoughts when they heard the sound of a jet engine above the house. Kara, who was a lot more short-tempered these days, scowled as she looked through the walls and saw the black jet. She practically disappeared from the bed. There was only one person she knew who had a jet like that, and he was not welcome here. She zoomed in front of the landing jet, though she quickly calmed down when she looked inside and saw it wasn't who she thought it was. Out of the plane came Barbara and Dick, the former of which immediately ran towards Kara and embraced her. Barbara had been just as emotional as her friend was this past month. She had known Mark for years before, and so it hurt a lot to see him die in such a fashion. But for her, that wasn't even the worst part. Barbara looked up at Kara with a tear-filled expression. "Kara, I need to tell you something." Kara looked at her with slight confusion, and then looked behind her to where Dick was standing. He had a grim expression on his face as if someone had just died. Kara looked back down to Barbara. "What is this about?" she asked as she wiped her own eyes. "Let's go inside first," she said as she grabbed Kara's hand and walked into the house. She was surprised when she saw Corey, who was in a skimpy nightdress, walk down the stairs. While Barbara had been having an awful time recently, she couldn't help but feel a bit better when the tall girl smiled brightly and pulled her into a hug. "Friend Barbara, it is good to see you once more. I haven't seen you since I ran away from you at the cafe," she said as she hugged the redhead tightly. "It's good to see you too, Corey," she said as she allowed herself to sink into her friend. Dick walked in and couldn't help but blush when he saw the beautiful Tamaranian dressed in next to nothing. "Hey Corey, long time no see," he said, trying to be casual. Corey looked up at him and smiled. "It has indeed been a while. How are the rest of the team doing?" she asked while squeezing Barbara into her melons. "They're doing well, though I think we've all taken Raven's departure a bit hard," he said slightly sullenly. Kara came in last and quickly pushed past Dick. "Barbara, what is it you need to tell me?" she asked as her concern and curiosity were both rising. Barbara detached herself from Corey and sighed before grabbing Kara's hand and leading her to the living room. Once they sat down, she took something out of her pocket. It was a lead box. It didn't take Kara long to figure out what must have been in there. But when Barbara opened the box, to her surprise, it was a metal syringe filled with a pale red liquid. There should have been 3 syringes, but 2 of them were empty, leaving only 1 left. Kara felt a rush of dizziness and started to feel sick. She understood why when she saw the needle wasn't metal but kryptonite. Barbara quickly closed it as she saw Kara go pale. "What are you showing me, Barbara?" Kara asked as she rubbed her head, trying to regain her focus. Barbara looked uneasy as she faced Kara. "A while ago we foiled a plan by Lex Luthor. He was going to drug Superman and make the world think he'd gone rogue, and soon after he would swoop in and defeat him," she explained. "Me, Dick and Batman stopped him, and Batman then took these and locked them in the vault in the Batcave," she continued. Kara looked at her with scrunched eyebrows. "What are they, Barbara?" she asked severely, her temper rising. "It's a diluted and liquidized form of red kryptonite. According to Luthor's notes, when used on a Kryptonian, it wouldn't bring about a full personality change but would amplify emotions that they might not feel often," Barbara said in a low voice. At this point, Dick couldn't help but clench his fists as he looked down at the box in disgust. "When we took the box, there were 3 syringes full of the liquid, and now there is only 1, she finished. When she looked back up at Kara, she felt that she might have made a mistake in telling her. She'd never seen her look so angry before. "Where is he?" she asked with bright red eyes. Mark always thought he was a good person. He tried his best to help people where he could, and he even tried to help his mom out by making enough money to move them out of Gotham. But it turned out he was wrong. He was a bad person. He was scum, a regular villain. How could he not be when he was living in hell? He could barely move, and right now he had to lie there as Harley lay next to him watching a film on the TV. She'd also had popcorn in a bowl. And where was the bowl placed? It was in his wood, and when he asked her why, she said it was the perfect place to hold it. Mark sighed as he looked at the TV. I hate this film, he thought to himself. Harley, if you're going to use me as a popcorn holder, can you at least give me some? Mark asked. Harley snorted as she looked at him. Are you some kinda idiot? Where would it even go if I gave it to ya? She said while laughing. That's a fair point actually, he thought to himself. Can you at least change the film? This is the third time you've watched it. She covered his mouth with her hand. Say ch, this is the best part, she said as she sat up. Noah, I wrote you every day for a year. Allie, you wrote me? Noah, yes. Noah, it wasn't over. Noah, it still isn't over. Noah and Allie then embraced in a loving kiss in the rain that slowly escalated into a passionate lovemaking scene. Ah, look how romantic it is, Marky, Harley said as she bounced up and down on the bed. I don't care, just please don't do dash. This romance is making me feel hot and bothered, Harley said as she fanned herself. She then reached over Mark, pressing her melons into his face, and grabbed something out of her drawer. Buzz, this is the fourth time. If you're going to do it, can you not do it right next to me? Mark complained, but in response Harley just hit him on the head with her vibrator. Mark felt like he was going to cry when he felt a wet patch on his head. Hey Buster. This is my house and my bed, so if I want I could do it right on your face. But it's only Tuesday and it's not something Allie would do, Harley said as she pointed the vibrator at him. Please throw me back in the ocean, Mark said as he closed his eyes. Oh, don't you worry, there'll be an ocean here in a minute, Harley said with a manic chuckle. Buzz recognized Batman 02. Batman walked through the Zeta Tube and onto the watchtower. Superman had called a meeting for the founding members of the Justice League, and while Batman was busy, he knew that he couldn't avoid a meeting like this. He needed to get back to work. Crime in Gotham never slept, and he wouldn't be able to rest easier until he knew their planet was safe from a full-on invasion force. As he walked through the corridors of the watchtower, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes as he saw that it was empty. Ever since he and the others first formed the Justice League, they realized that it would grow beyond them and attract like-minded people. However, what concerned Batman was that none of these people were here. The door to the meeting room was opened, and inside stood the core members of the Justice League, sat in their seats, all with stern expressions on their faces. He felt the palms of his hands itch when he saw them, as if his body was telling him to defend himself, and already he was formulating plans on who to take out first and in with what. Apart from the Justice League, he looked to the side and saw Supergirl, Starfire, but most surprising was that Barbara and Dick were there. The latter two had disappointed looks on their face, while the former looked like they wanted to rip him limb from limb. It made him automatically reach for the lead container on his utility belt. Bruce, please come in and take a seat, Superman said with a stern voice, breaking the silence that had engulfed the room. Narrowing his eyes, Batman obliged and took a seat at the end of the table. Though he didn't relax, he made sure to position himself in case he needed to make a quick escape. What is this about? You pulled me away from some important work, Batman said sternly as he looked at the different members. He makes eye contact with Martian Manhunter, who looks away and instead looks to his feet in what Batman recognizes is a shame. I know you don't like dancing around the subject, Bruce, so I'll get straight to the point, Superman said, and he slammed a lead case onto the table with a bit more force than intended. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what this is, Bruce, Superman stated. No, he simply replied. Then I'll ask something else. Did you inject me with liquefied red kryptonite at any point? Superman asked with slight hope in his voice. While he knew his best friend could be secretive and manipulative, he was almost certain that he wouldn't have gone this far. Though for longer than necessary, Batman did not reply. He only looked at the box and then shifted his gaze to the guests in the room before finally speaking. Yes, I did, he said emotionlessly. Boom! Before Batman even blinked, Supergirl was in front of him. It was clear she had tried to attack him, but Superman had intercepted her and caught her fist, then wrapped his arms around her. Kara scowled at Batman. You bastard. You drugged my cousin into killing Mark, she said as she tried to escape the grasp of Superman. The rest of the League looked on in shock. They knew Batman pretty well and knew he had various plans to incapacitate them, but for him to go this far was a shock to them. I'll kill you, she shouted with her eyes glowing red. Kara, enough. This isn't you, Superman shouted. He then turned her away from Batman and carried her to the door. Starfire. Batgirl, can you please take Kara to the cafeteria, he asked, and they immediately nodded. When Superman let go of Kara, she shoved him off her and stormed out the meeting room. Bruce, I think we are owed an explanation of why you did it, Superman said with a defeated sigh. He did hope that his friend hadn't done it, but that was dashed against the floor now. Everyone here has gotten too comfortable. With what we learned 10 years ago, I'd have thought at least some of you would be more concerned with the possibility of an alien invasion. Batman said sternly as he looked around everyone at the table. We have not forgotten Bruce, but the world won't stop for us and there is still a fair amount of evil that needs to be dealt with on Earth, Wonder Woman stated. She's right, Bruce, we often work most of the week to keep the world safe. That's why we agreed to expand the League in the first place, Superman said in agreement. It doesn't explain why you drugged Superman. After last time I was willing to let it go, but you've crossed the line with this, Flash said as he leaned forward in his chair. He was being uncharacteristically serious as he was concerned with what else Batman would do if he did this to Superman. Superman is the only one here that could subdue Mark on his own, with the exception of maybe Wonder Woman, Batman said as he started to speak. He then looked toward Superman. You are soft, you pull your punches, and you often let yourself fall into traps that could be avoided despite being the strongest man in the world. If Mark were to free his father, and we had 2 Viltrumites running around, how many of you here could confidently say that we could take them? Batman asked. For a whole, no one says a thing, because they know how difficult it was subduing Omni-Man before. Things are different than 10 years ago, Bruce. We have more heroes to fight the good fight, Superman reasoned. What about 3 Viltrumites, or 4? How many would it take for them to turn our planet into ash or enslave us all? Batman shouted as he slammed his fist on the table. He then looks at Superman. I had to be sure you wouldn't let him get away or pull any punches, Batman. You got that boy killed for no other reason than who his father was, and I am responsible for helping you by keeping Supergirl and Starfire incapacitated, John said. His voice was heavy with regret, and he hadn't looked up this whole meeting. I didn't want Mark to be killed. It was a mistake and an oversight, Batman said as he clenched his fists. And yet he is dead. I can still feel my hand pierce through his stomach, and I will have to live with that for the rest of my life, Superman said. It begs the question, where do we go from here? Wonder Woman stated. She had not known Mark long, but she wished she could have met him properly. She'd never met a man capable of withstanding the temptation a golden apple exudes. We can't hand him over to the authorities. Having his identity compromised would be dangerous for not only him but those associated with both Batman and Bruce Wayne, Flash stated, which Superman and the rest nodded in agreement. However, 2 people at the table who had not spoken saw things differently. I vote all charges against him be dropped, Hal said, shocking almost everyone there. Seconded, Arthur boomed out in his deep voice. Explain, Superman asked, but it was more of a command. The Green Lantern Corps has encountered the Viltrumites numerous times in the past, and every time we have it's been a slaughter. I've seen the recordings and I've seen one Viltrumite turn an entire planet into rubble. I've seen them cut down a whole squad of lanterns like they weren't even there, Hal explained. I don't agree with Bruce's methods, but I think he's right about us not taking this seriously enough, he continued. Protecting one's kingdom comes at a cost, though I would advise against using such methods in the future, Arthur said in agreement. Then shall we vote? Superman said to all of them. 1 month later, where is my rabbit, Mark? Harley shouted as she looked through her various drawers and cupboards, even looking under the bed. How am I supposed to know? He shouted back as he pushed himself up against the bed. He still couldn't move, but his upper body had regained a lot of its former vitality, and he actually felt normal again. Harley jumped on the bed, straddling him. You know what you did. So cough it up, she shouted as she checked behind him and under his pillow. Mark pushed her off, and she landed next to him on the bed. I can't move, Harley, how could I touch your stuff, he said as he folded his arms. Of course, he was responsible for throwing away her rampant rabbit, but he wasn't going to tell her that. He was sick and tired of watching her masturbate every night, especially since his schlong started working again. Harley got up on her knees and narrowed her eyes at him. I'm watching you, she said as she pointed at him. She then jumped out of bed with a smile on her face, seemingly forgetting about it. Well, I guess I'll just have to go get a new one, she said as she grabbed her phone from the side and dialed a number on it. Hey Ivy, I need you to look after Schlong Block over here, she said louder than usual. Whatcha mean you can't? Whatcha mean you busy with his garden? She shouted. I can stay here, just leave me on my own, Mark stated. I can't leave him alone. I think he's gone through my underwear drawer, she said through the last part in a whisper. Though Mark still heard it and sighed. I'm not looking through your underwear drawer, I can't move. Harley turned around and widened her eyes. I think he has some sort of super ears too, she whispered. You're standing at the other side of the bed. Fine, I'll just take him with me, she said before hanging up and throwing her phone down. I'm supposed to be in hiding. You think taking me out is a good idea, Mark said with a raised eyebrow. Harley smirked before running over to her wardrobe and grabbing something out of it. She then walked back to the bed and held 2 objects in her hands. Are you serious? Mark said as he ran his hands through his hair. Come on. It'll be fine. This will make sure no one finds out who you are, Harley said with a broad smile. And how am I supposed to go out? I still can't walk yet, Mark asked. This time Harley ran into a different room and then came out with a wheelchair, though this one was pretty fancy, and it had X's on the wheels. Where did you get that from? He asked. Harley shrugged. Some baldy was being a bastard. So I pushed him out of the wheelchair and took it, she said with a grin. About as much as I'd expect from her, Mark said with a sigh. Fine, help me out of bed, he said, finally admitting defeat. Harley clapped her hands together and quickly walked to the bed. Harley pushed Mark in the wheelchair down the streets in Brooklyn. While Harley had dressed herself as flamboyantly as she usually did minus her actual criminal outfit, Mark couldn't help but feel as if she had dressed him this way on purpose. When I can walk again, I'm going to break everything she loves, he thought to himself as he went down the street dressed in a loose tank top with black trousers and combat boots. The worst part about the outfit wasn't how incredibly loose it was, but the part that was used to disguise his face. It's fine, Marky, you look amazing, Mark said, mocking her voice. On his face was a Lucador mask, more specifically Bane's mask that Harley had stolen from him at some point. Huh? Did you say something, Marky? Harley said as she leaned over his shoulder. No, I don't say anything, he quickly said as he leaned on his arm. He just wanted to get this over with. At least he didn't have to worry about people mistaking him for Bane. He was in a wheelchair and about 100 pounds too light. We are here. Harley shouted in excitement as she pushed him into the store. People are going to think I'm a gimp, Mark thought to himself as he was wheeled into the pleasure store. Harley wheeled him around the store with blatant excitement on her face as she looked at the different products on the stand. Marky. Look at that one, it's bigger than my arm, she said as she cackled, though in her excitement she ended up letting go of Mark while she was pushing him, sending him down the aisle. Harley looked at the different lingerie they had on offer and smirked. She grabbed a few different outfits and turned around to say something to Mark only to realize he wasn't there. Marky? Where you at? She said loudly as she looked around. She then smiled evilly as she saw him. She skipped towards Mark as he tried to wheel himself out of the store. Where you think you're going, Marky? I need someone here to tell me how pretty I look, she said with a grin as she grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. Mark silently cursed as he was taken back into the fires of hell. So close, he thought to himself. She wheeled Mark towards the dressing room and locked the wheels outside. Wait here, let me change, she said and went inside and closed a curtain. Mark leaned on his hand and waited for Harley to finish getting changed. He hoped he'd be able to walk soon even if he wasn't fully healed. Ta-da! She shouted as she opened the curtain. She had a black and red silk bra on that had see-through lace veil that split in the middle and went down to her, but she wore fishnet stockings that had straps attached to her silk underwear. You like it, Marky? She said with a grin. No. He simply replied, though it was obviously a lie. She was beautiful normally, but wearing that outfit she looked downright hot. Her melons almost squeezed out of the silk bra and her legs were framed nicely by the stockings, though Mark refused to look at her, but too dangerous. Harley smirked at him and narrowed her eyes. Oh, you don't think I'm beautiful? She said as she started to slowly stalk over towards him. Mark looked up and frowned. What are you doing? Why are you approaching me? He said to her, but she didn't answer. She just kept walking towards him with a sultry smile on her face. Please stop, he said as he tried to wheel away, but the brakes were locked. Harley knelt and started crawling towards him, showing a large amount of her cleavage as she did. She ran her hands up his legs slowly, standing up and rubbing her body against him as she did. She slowly straddled him, pressing her body close to him. Mark could feel every curve and found himself almost instantly getting hard. Harley grabbed him by the chin and lifted it up. Are you sure? She whispered before pecking his nose and grinning as she felt his schlong press into her. Excuse me, you can't do this in the store. An employee shouted as she walked into the changing room. Harley just scowled and turned her head. Can't you see I'm busy? She shouted at the employee before getting off Mark and walking back into the changing room in a huff. Sorry about her, Mark said to the shop employee. The employee looked at him for a second. The whips and butt plugs are upstairs on the left-hand side, she said before leaving. Mark really hated this mask. Kara had spent the entire month on the watchtower. She didn't think she could stay at her and Mark's house for the moment, and she also wanted to be here to make sure Batman didn't escape. The League had decided that Batman was justified in his concern that Mark would free Omni-Man. However, his drugging of Superman and by extension killing of Mark was not justified, and so to avoid his identity being revealed and to allow him to continue his work, he was confined to the watchtower for an indeterminate amount of time. Right now she stood outside the high-security cell in the watchtower. She had considered whether what she was about to do was right or not, but she felt that she owed it to him. She opened the cell and walked inside, her hand rubbing her stomach, which had swelled slightly over the past month. As she approached the end cell, she breathed out and opened it before stepping inside. Inside, Nolan was sitting on his bed reading as he usually did. He looked up and saw someone walk inside. "You're new." He spoke out to her, his voice echoing across his cell. Kara felt nervous as she stepped in front of his cell. Her hand was still over her belly protectively. "You're Omni-Man," she said, but it came out as a whisper. Nolan put his book down and stood up. "I am. And who are you?" he said as he approached the glass wall of the cell. "I am Kara Zor-El," she replied. She felt nervous being stared at by Mark's father, but she steeled herself. "I knew your son, he and I were together," she spoke out. Nolan smirked. "What do you want, Kryptonian?" he asked as he crossed his arms. "Regardless of what you've done, I thought I owed it to you and Mark to let you know if your grandchild," she said as she rubbed her stomach. Nolan raised an eyebrow and then looked at her slightly swelled belly. He then started to chuckle. "At least Mark was able to do something useful before he died," he replied. "Excuse me. I don't think I heard you right," she said as she clenched her fists and started to heat up. Mark was not fit to be a Viltrumite. If he was, then he'd be alive, and Superman would be the one in the ground, he stated. 18 years wasted because of that disappointment. But at least he did one good thing and made another partner for me to conquer this backwater planet with, he finished with a laugh. Boom! Kara punched the glass to his cell with a vicious look on her face. "You won't touch my baby. If you do, I'll rip your heart out of your chest." She spat as the glass slightly cracked around her fist. She couldn't stand to see his smug face anymore, and so she turned around and left the cell, leaving Nolan alone once more. Nolan floated upwards and drew his fist back and punched the glass. The force was immediately redirected back to him and forced him back. However, the small crack in the glass got slightly larger and Nolan grinned. He turned back around and sat on his bed. He'd need to wait for the right moment. 1 month later. Mark stood up in the middle of Harley's apartment, breathing heavily as he started going through another round of shadowboxing. He felt as if he was almost healed and his strength was slowly returning to normal, but he still couldn't fly and his strength wasn't even close to what it was before. He had lived nearly his whole life as a regular human, and yet now he felt vulnerable. He stopped shadowboxing and looked down at the indentation on his stomach. Harley had said his internal organs looked as if they'd healed or regenerated, and so it was just a matter of the muscle repairing itself. When he asked her how she knew that, she just replied that she was a doctor, and when he asked her a doctor, she just told him to shut up. Mark breathed out as he dropped out of his stance before grabbing a towel and wiping the sweat off his forehead. As he placed it around his neck, the door to the apartment was unlocked, and shortly after it was kicked open as Harley stumbled in with the shopping. She looked at him standing there without a shirt on for a second. "What, you need a wheelchair? Come and help, bastard," she shouted as she walked towards the kitchen. Most of her apartment was open plan and designed as quite a large studio, so it wasn't a very long trip towards the kitchen. Mark sighed and walked towards her, lifting the bags from her right hand and placing them on the counter. "Such a wench," he whispered to himself. Harley spun her head around. "Huh? You say something," she shouted at him as she put the shopping on the counter. "Yeah, I called you a wench. Bastard. Tramp. Simp. Idiot. Nut job. You're calling me a nut job. That's rich coming from you," Mark shouted back as they were both in each other's faces. Harley pushed her finger into his chest. "Which one of us tried to take on Superman in a fist fight? If that ain't crazy, Marky, then I don't know what is," she said with a cackle. "I do, you," he said with an arrogant smirk before turning around and looking through the bags of shopping. So he was completely caught off guard when Harley jumped on his back and started bashing him in the head with her own shoe. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted as he stumbled around the room trying to shake her off. "You take it back. I am not crazy," she shouted as she hit him in the head with her heels. "I am completely and totally normal," she shouted, hitting him with each word. "None of this is normal," Mark shouted as he tried reaching behind him to get her off. He went over to the bed and turned around. Harley was too busy hitting him in the head to pay attention to what he was doing. She squealed in surprise when Mark jumped into the air, landing on her. "Ow. Marky, why are you so heavy? You need to lose some weight," she cried as her legs untangled from around him. Mark breathed a sigh of relief before rolling off of her. "Piss off, Harley," he said with a slight chuckle. "I gotcha that burger you asked for, by the way," Harley said as she looked up at the ceiling. "Thanks, Harles, but I think I might rest here for a second," Mark replied as he put his arms behind his head and slowly drifted off to sleep. "Chickadee China, the Chinese chicken, you have a drumstick and your brain stops ticking. Watching X-Files with no lights on. My bad, Marky. My phone is not on silent, Harley said as she pulled it out of her pocket and answered it. This is Dr. Harleen Quinzel. To whom am I talking to? She said as she suppressed her normal Brooklyn accent. Oh, it's just you. Watcha one. I already told you to screw off 3 times already, Harley said, switching back to her normal voice. Mark turned and could see she had an annoyed expression on her face, and it made him wonder who she was talking to. Oh damn your mother, Baldy. I don't have time for your crap. I'm a landlord, you know. I'm legit now, she said in a pissy voice. Mark had lived with Harley long enough to recognize a little Harley tantrum incoming, so he got out of bed and prepared himself. Well, send them. I don't care, she shouted before throwing her phone across the room and to the wall. You okay, Harl? Mark asked from the kitchen as he took his burger out of one of the paper bags. Harley stood up, stomping towards the kitchen. She took the burger out of Mark's hand as he was about to take a bite and took a big one herself. She moaned at the taste and took another one. Sure, help yourself, Mark said, rolling his eyes. Harley flipped him off. You know how I stress eat. It's not my fault, she said as she took another bite from the burger. Mark then grabbed it back and started eating it. What was that call about? He asked as he leaned against the kitchen counter. Harley muttered curse words as she jumped up and sat on the counter. Just some bald bastard trying to get me to rejoin the Legion of Boomers or some shit, she said before taking back a Mark's burger. I'd have thought Luther would be more interested in your boyfriend, Mark said with a snort. He's NGTMG Pfeiffiend, Harley said with a mouthful of food as she threw the burger wrapper at him. Swallow, dumbass, Mark said, taking the last bit of burger from her and shoving it in his mouth. Harley did so before wiping her mouth. I have not been with that jerk for ages, and I won't be again. I'm a strong, independent ex-villain, she said with a proud smile. They only want me because they can't find Jorker. He's been off the grid for a while now, Harley said as she pulled a drink out of one of the paper bags. Harley then got off the counter and started pacing. And it's not even like they want me because I'm so awesome. They just know that I have something they want to put on the underground auction. She shouted as she threw her hands up in the air. Mark raised an eyebrow before taking Harley's drink and taking a sip. Underground auction? He asked, wondering what it was. He could guess from the title, but he was sure that it was probably different from the trashy one they had in Gotham. Harley just waved him off. Just a place where rich bastards buy rare crap. Basically Baldy's wet dream, she explained. And just cause I don't want to join, they're sending the League of Asshats after me, she said with an incredulous look on her face. Mark was nodding along the entire time, though her last words snapped him out of his daze. Wait, who's after you? He asked with slight concern. Harley took her drink back and sipped at. League of Assassins. They're a bunch of pretentious psychos. Love the smell of their own crap, she said before snorting at her own joke. Mark looked around the apartment with a bit more concern now. He hadn't heard of them before, but if there were enough assassins to consider it a league, then they should be more worried than they currently were. So what are you gonna do? Mark asked with slight concern. Harley just shrugged and downed the rest of her drink. They aren't here now, so, movie? She asked with a grin. Click. I think you might be wrong about that, Mark whispered as he heard the door to the balcony click, and since he'd locked it he could tell it had just been picked. Harley's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She just casually strolled through her apartment like nothing was wrong. Mark turned around and started putting the shopping away. He closed his eyes and imagined his mind stretching out. After fighting Superman, he'd realized he had minor telepathic powers, and luckily enough it seemed to be one of the few Viltrumite abilities he'd regained despite his injuries, so it gave him time to practice. While it was only useful for reading surface-level thoughts and sending his own, it had another function, and that was to let him know how many people were in his range. 3 people, 2 on the balcony, and 1 coming through the front door, he thought to himself. Can you believe in the Notebook that Noah shadow-inked with Allie 3 times? Mark shouted to Harley, who was behind a partition getting changed. I mean, poor Allie, she had it 2 times back doors and once in the front. She probably couldn't walk afterwards. He continued shouting as he put the milk away. He then walked over to the front door. However, he lightened his steps to the point where they made no sound at all. He looked through the eye hole and saw what looked to be a woman in a black outfit with a hood covering her face and mouth. He stood back slightly from the door and looked over at Harley, who had changed into red and black hot pants with fishnet stockings. She also wore a red and black vest, and in her hands was a large gun. She silently walked over to the balcony door, which was around the corner in her apartment. Mark turned back to the front door and held his hand up, waiting for Harley to go apes hit. Bang 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 bang. Mark used his powers and pushed the door out of the frame, launching the person behind it into the wall. He kept the assassin trapped behind the door as he kept applying pressure. He heard their ribcage crack and decided they'd had enough and let them fall to the ground. As he walked outside to inspect them, he saw a glint in the corner of his eye. He ducked immediately and was barely able to avoid the sword that almost decapitated him. He jumped backwards and looked down the hallway. He cursed as he saw more than 10 people dressed in the same clothes waiting for him. Lex Luthor sat in his office looking over the city of Metropolis. This was more than his office to him. It was his throne room, and it was where he ruled. But like any ruler, he faced his share of problems with his subjects. However, he could live with that. But what he could not live with was the populace worshipping a man who wasn't even from this planet. No. He would not forgive such an insult, and so he would kill Superman. But mortal men such as himself do not have the means to do such a thing, or at least so he thought. He walked back to his seat and sat down looking at a picture that was on his desk. Damn you, Joker. Things would have already started if you'd stuck to the plan, he thought to himself. Mr. Luthor, a female voice called out as she walked into his office. Yes, Mercy? He asked while looking up from the photo. The League have engaged Harley and should be securing the package soon, she stated. Excellent. Let me know when the package is in transit, he told her before dismissing her. He went back to looking at the photo on his desk. It was a photo of a rock that glowed a silverish color, platinum kryptonite. With you I'll take my rightful place in this world. Mark was kicked in the chest, sending him backwards onto the bed. He grunted in pain as the kick was close enough to the wound to send a jolt of pain throughout his body. He was glad that he had his powers at the moment, as all of these assassins fought nearly as well as Batman did, and he was having a difficult time keeping up. Bang bang, Harley shot at one of the League members who was able to avoid both of her shots. How can all you bastards dodge bullets? It's such bullshit. She shouted as she flipped backwards, avoiding a slice from a katana. They were slowly being herded in by the League, as they had to constantly back off as they had the disadvantage in close combat. Hey, Marky, wanna blow these bastards away? Harley shouted as she shot at them again, only for them to jump and dive out of the way. I was holding off since I didn't want to make a big commotion and catch a hero's attention, but seems we are in a bit of trouble if I don't, Mark said as he threw a kick at one of the assassins' chests, sending them back a bit. He turned around and ran towards Harley. She yelped as he picked her up and threw her over his shoulder. As he ran towards the balcony, Harley shot at them from on top of his shoulder as she cackled loudly. Holding his hand up, he burst through the brick wall and jumped out. He still wasn't sure how he could make other people weightless, as his power was like discovering he had another arm with different aspects of it being his fingers. However, he was able to push them both over to the next building. Ha ha ha, that was fun. Do it again. Harley shouted as she wiggled on his shoulders. Mark put her down and started to concentrate. Holding his palm up, he focused his power to repel into a single point. The wind started to blow fiercely and the air crackled with a red static. Eventually, a red orb formed in his palm. Mark was sweating as he had never overexerted his power like this before. Then the wind stopped blowing and Mark held his hand up to Harley's apartment building. With a flick of his finger, the orb rocketed towards the building, and the whole top of the apartment was ripped off the building and sent crumbling down into the ocean. Mark then leaned over and put his hands on his knee. Marky. He heard Harley say. He looked up at her and saw she had an unamused expression on her face. He gave her a thumbs up. We win. Yay, he said quietly. What the hell did you do to my apartment? Where am I going to live now? I will wreck your shit, you dumb AP bastard. John Johns was alone on the watchtower, apart from the few heroes that had chosen to live up here. Most of the original 7 were off on various missions that seemed to have popped up out of nowhere. He was happy to stay here, but he can't say he liked being here while Batman, Supergirl, and Starfire were present. She had still not forgiven John for his role in Mark's death, and John could understand that. He had not even forgiven himself yet, and he doubted he ever would. His biggest disappointment was in Batman himself. He had trusted the man implicitly, and so to find out that he had dosed Superman made him wonder if all of the team were so trustworthy. Of course he knew they were, but he had doubts that would sometimes spring to mind. The greatest burden a telepath had to bear was to not let your doubts make you do something unethical. Martians were not like humans. Humans liked their privacy, and as an alien John had to respect such things. Red alert. Breakout in Cell 001. John's eyes widened as he heard the announcement, one that he wished he would never hear. He quickly phased through the ground and straight to the prison wing. When he arrived, he saw that the glass to Nolan's cell was broken, and he was not there. Squelched. John looked down and saw that a fist had been impaled through his chest. Nolan. You should know better than anyone that such tactics would not work against me, he stated as he turned his head around, only to be met with the body of Red Arrow, whose arm had been forced into John. His neck was floppy. It seemed his spine had been snapped. Believe me, I've learned from my past mistakes, Nolan said from above him as he stuck several of Roy's arrows into John. They started beeping before they exploded, and John screamed in pain as the internal explosion caused him to lose control of his form and kneel to the ground. You really are disgusting. Hardly any better than the monkeys that infest this planet, Nolan said as he pulled out another arrow from Roy's quiver. They are resourceful though, something that will serve the Empire well, he said as he looked at the arrow before it clicked open. He then pointed it towards John, and it spewed out a small but steady stream of fire at him, making him scream louder. When it ran out, John was on the ground whimpering in pain. He tried to send a mental shutdown towards Nolan, but like before with his limited telepathy, he was able to construct barriers that were capable of blocking him. Nolan grabbed John by the neck and flew through the walls and straight into the command center. He then tossed the weakened John to the ground. It isn't very satisfying knowing my fists don't hurt you the same way they hurt the others. But it won't stop me from doing it, he said before mounting him and punching him hard enough to shake the station. Call them, he said, dragging John over to the console. But the Martian made no effort to, and instead phased through his hand and down through the floor. Nolan cursed before inspecting the console. They'd figure it out soon enough, but maybe this would help. He pressed a large red button, and the watchtower started to sound an alarm once more, only this time shutters started to descend and the orbital station went into full lockdown mode. Nolan cracked his arms and back before turning around, while he waited for the rest of them to show he supposed he could enjoy a quick hunt. Is there a reason why I have to carry you on my back? Mark said drearily as he walked down the road towards the bus station. Harley just hit him on the head with her fist. You banged my house until I get a new one, you better believe you're carrying me, Buster, she said before going back to leaning her chin on his head. Mark sighed. He didn't expect the explosion to be that powerful, but at least he knew now. He really should go somewhere and test his powers. Why do we have to get the bus? Don't you have a car? He asked. As soon as he had told Harley they could use his house, she jumped on his back and slapped him on the butt, commanding him to move forward. But since he couldn't fly yet, he couldn't take them to it. Pa, a car? In New York? Are you an idiot or something? She said while laughing. Well, why don't you steal one? Mark asked, only to get hit on the head again. Why don't you just steal one? Harley said, mocking Mark's voice. I am an ex-villain, thank you very much. I don't commit crimes anymore, I even stopped jumping the turnstile, she said with a hint of pride in her voice. You could at least thank me, you know. I did save us from the League of Assassins, Mark said as he rolled his eyes. You didn't save my house though, did you? Harley said as she bit his ear. As they walked down the bustling streets of New York heading towards the station, Mark noticed they were getting a lot of stares from the people passing by them. He suddenly realized that what they were doing must look pretty strange. He was walking down the road with a fully grown woman on his back as she hit him on the head and bit him. Mark didn't know when it happened, but at some point living with Harley must have desensitized him to all her batshit crazy behavior. I need a holiday after this, he thought to himself. Though he did recognize the humor of relaxing and recovering after just spending a few months doing the same thing. Hate him as you missed the turn, Harley shouted as she pointed to the left he had just missed. Though when she went to hit him on the head again, he didn't feel it. OW. She shouted as she banged her fist against what felt like a steel wall. Mark's eyes widened and he grinned. He took a coin out of his pocket and flicked it upwards. It shot into the air and they quickly lost track of it. You got your powers back? Well, about time. You can start fixing up my apartment. She shouted in excitement as she wiggled on his back. I could just toss her off me and fly away. Mark thought with a smirk as he continued to walk down the road. But she did take care of me these last 2 months. I do kind of owe her, and I did destroy her house, so maybe. Nah, Mark thought as he grabbed Harley off his back and tossed her to the ground while laughing. He then crouched down and pushed off the ground, shooting up into the air. Only he didn't stay that way and he quickly fell to the ground. Oh, seems like not all my powers are back yet. He thought as he landed on the ground, cracking the concrete. He had landed in the same space he was in before, so he knew Harley was right behind him. He turned around with a sheepish smile on his face. Harley had her arms crossed and was looking at him with a very unimpressed expression. Did you just try to fly away and leave me in New York without an apartment or anything to my name? Harley asked in a cool tone as she narrowed her eyes at Mark. Mark laughed nervously. No. He said unconvincingly. Even to himself that sounded like a lie. Yeah, there is no salvaging the situation, Mark thought to himself right before he turned back around and started running to the bus station. Get back here. Die. Fire shouted as she unleashed a torrent of flames at Nolan, who calmly walked through the corridors of the watchtower. The green flames scorched the metal surfaces as they impacted him. Next to fire was Ice, who had been trying to impede Nolan's advances by covering the hallway with ice and creating walls, though they did next to nothing to stop the Viltrumites' advance. Fire intensified the flames, giving it all she had to try and turn the man into ash. She had just seen Nolan tear one of the heroes in half with a grin on his face. She knew if she couldn't kill or at least injure him, then they would all die for sure. She felt herself slipping out of her flame form as the torrent she sent at Nolan died down. Good amount of heat. I'm sure in the Empire you'd make a good chef. Fire heard from behind the smoke as Nolan walked through it completely unharmed. Though it's a shame you won't be alive to find out, he continued as he speed right in front of her. Fire! Ice shouted as she formed a wall between them and Nolan, and then grabbed Fire by the arm, dragging her down the corridor. Nolan easily smashes past the ice with a wave of his hand. It amuses me how hard you try, Nolan said as he zoomed in front of them, making them fall on their backs. He steps on Ice's leg and the sound of bones crunching echoes out through the corridor, making her scream. Fire shoots a ball of green flames into Nolan's face to try and force him away from Ice, but it doesn't work and he grabs Ice by the throat before dragging her to the wall. Normally, I am rather efficient when exterminating vermin, but being kept prisoner by you insects has made me quite annoyed, Nolan said. Thud thud thud. Nolan smashed Ice's face into the metal wall again and again. After the third hit she went limp, but he kept on going as blood splattered on his face. Fire looked on in horror as her face was turned into a mushy paste. Nolan then threw her limp body to the ground before turning his gaze to Fire, who started crawling away on her back. Please. Please. Stop. She begged. Whether it's now or in 50 years you'll still die. Why even bother begging, he said as he lifted his arm up. However, he stopped as he was about to smash her face into a pulp when he heard heavy footsteps on the metal coming down the corridor. He turned and saw a large man with a blue mask on. Fire recognized him immediately and felt slightly relieved. Atom Smasher, she thought as she smiled. Fire. Run. He shouted as he suddenly started to grow larger. He drew his fist back and threw it at Nolan as hard as he could. Though it all seemed for naught as the punch didn't even make Nolan budge. With one hand he pushed Atom Smasher back. The different abilities you Earthlings have are certainly interesting. Viltrumite scientists will love dissecting you, he said before punching Atom Smasher's hand and breaking every bone in it. HHHHGHHHHH. He shouted as he clutched his hand. Though he wouldn't be in pain for long as Nolan flew up and sliced his head off his neck with just his hand. Fire got up on her feet and started to try and run again, but in her heart, she knew it was futile. Squelched, she stopped moving and looked down. She could see Nolan's fist piercing through her chest. She felt blood fill her throat as it started to choke her. She couldn't feel her body anymore, and when Nolan removed his arm she fell to the ground lifeless. Nolan just smiled as he kicked her body out of the way. After 1,000 years, killing weaklings loses its novelty. But after what these Earthlings did, I'm starting to enjoy myself once more, he said as he continued down the corridor. Bang! Nolan was slammed through the wall as he was punched multiple times. He was then slammed through the ground and to a lower level of the watchtower. He got up and looked through the hole, seeing Supergirl descend through it with her eyes blazing red. Her whole body was trembling with rage as she had to listen to Nolan kill so many people she knew. She wanted to stop him before the fight even started, but Corey had stopped her and forced her to stay, telling her to think of her baby. But she couldn't take it any longer. She wouldn't stand by and let him kill anyone else. I'm sorry, Corey, she thought to herself, as her friend wouldn't let her go under any circumstances, so she had to knock her out. It's you, the mother of my new partner, he said with amusement in his voice. Kara grits her teeth, wanting to wipe the smug smile off of his face. You know, there is room in the Empire for a Kryptonian. While you're useless under a red star, I'm sure we can do something to fix that, Nolan said, though before he could say anything else Kara sped forward and punched him in the face, sending him down the corridor. She had to be careful not to use too much strength. Her eyes then started to glow red and Kara's heat vision sizzled through the air, but Nolan swiftly dodged each blast. He zoomed towards her and retaliated with a series of rapid punches, the force of which drove Kara back. Their struggle echoed through the metal corridors, the sound of their blows reverberating throughout the station. She was completely on the defensive, as she had to protect her stomach in case Nolan decided to take a shot at her there. He then grabbed her as he flew towards her. As they grappled, the station's structure creaked and groaned under the strain of their clash. Nolan quickly overpowered Kara, and with a powerful heave, he hurled her through the unforgiving metal walls. As she flew, Kara twisted in mid-air, unleashing a barrage of searing heat vision in a desperate attempt to halt Nolan's pursuit. But he merely extended his hand, deflecting the energy with a mere gesture before swooping in to grasp her by the head, slamming her down onto the floor. With relentless force, Nolan continued his trajectory, his powerful flight dragging Kara's head along the cold, hard surface. Without mercy, he then flung her upward, sending her crashing through the ceiling and into the heart of the command center. The resounding crash echoed through the room. Grimacing, Kara felt a wave of concern wash over her as she felt a pain in her stomach, though she remained resolute, her determination unwavering even as Nolan closed in. Her fist shot forward, aiming for his jaw, but he intercepted it with practiced ease, his grip firm and unyielding. With a sudden yank, he brought her off balance, their bodies colliding in a forceful clash that left Kara reeling. The resounding thud of his headbutt reverberated through her skull, momentarily disorienting her as she fought to regain her bearings amidst the haze of pain. Nolan's rapid combination of strikes followed in quick succession, each blow finding its mark with a precision that left Kara struggling to defend herself. "If you weren't pregnant, perhaps you would have put up a better fight," Nolan said as he grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off the ground. "You're lucky. The only thing stopping me from killing you is the Viltrumite child growing in your womb, even if it will probably die anyway," he said with a chuckle. Kara's eyes widened at his words, but before she could ask what he meant, Nolan was punched in the back of the head, loosening his grip. Kara took the opportunity to put all her strength into an uppercut that launched him out of the station and into space. She looked at the person who saved her and saw it was John. He had managed to sneak up on them and attack him from behind. "Come, Kara, we need to leave before he comes back," John said, grabbing her by the arm. She nodded and they quickly flew back into the station. John quickly led her to a part of the station that looked to be a dead end, but he put his hand on the wall and it opened up into another corridor. They went further down the corridor, and at the end of it was a door. When they went inside, Kara scowled as she considered going back out there to fight Nolan. Inside, Batman was currently at the computer. This looked to be what he was using as his workspace/cell J. He's on his way and should be there in a minute. "Once he's back on Earth, we need to leave the station and join the rest of the League," Batman said without looking away from the computer. As soon as Nolan escaped, he started formulating a plan to take him down. He also contacted the League and had them all gather on Earth. Superman would be the one to lead him to the others, as space isn't ideal for most of the members. John nodded his head. "Supergirl, I believe it may be best for you to stay here. I would not wish for any harm to come to you or your baby," he said in a soft tone. Kara couldn't help but nod. While she wanted to fight her, she had already risked too much by fighting him the first time. She'd have to stay out of this and let the others deal with it. Outside of the watchtower, Nolan had just gotten his bearings. The punch from Supergirl had sent him a fair distance away as she managed to get a clean hit on him. "Enough fun. Kill the rest of them and take the girl," he thought to himself as he flew back towards the watchtower. However, before he could fly forward, someone was already in front of him. "Superman," Nolan said with a big grin on his face. Ever since he discovered there was a yellow sun-powered Kryptonian on Earth, he'd kept something special just for him. Unfortunately, last time he didn't get to use it. This time, however, he'd kill every single member of the Justice League. "I got you a juice box," Mark said as he sat down next to Harley at the bus station. After trying to stab him and having her favorite knife break in half, she was giving Mark the silent treatment. After spending so much time with her, and for her to suddenly start being quiet, it was pretty disturbing for Mark, so he was trying to bring her out of it. Harley ignored him and turned her head away from the offered juice box. "It's mango-flavored," he said, waving it in front of her, but she didn't budge and still kept ignoring him. Mark sighed and then reached into his other pocket, holding a small clear bottle with a red label in front of her. "Small bottle of vodka as well," he said, waving that in front of her face as well. This tempted her as she turned her head to look at the two drinks being waved in front of her. She huffed before grabbing them both from his hands. "I still haven't forgiven you," she said before downing the bottle of vodka and sipping on the juice box. Mark smirked. Yeah, I know," he said as he leant back against the wall behind his seat. "You better not try to leave me again when you get your fancy flying back. You owe me a house, Buster, and I'll be staying with you till I get it," she said as she pushed a finger into his chest. Mark held his hands up in surrender. "Why not just sell that thing Luthor wants? I'm sure you'd get a generous amount from him," he asked. Harley snorted. "Baldy would probably try to kill me before giving me the money." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Why would he do that?" "Because he'd assume I'd try and kill him," she explained. "Would you?" Mark asked. "Probably," she said with a shrug. Mark sighed. "I guess it doesn't matter. I'm sure the League have whatever it was unless it was at your apartment. Excuse me. I am a genius. I am one step ahead of those ninja bastards," she said as she reached between her melons and took out a small pouch. "I keep this puppy on me at all times," she said with a massive grin. "What is in there that's so important that the League of Assassins wants to get their hands on it?" he asked. Harley smirked at him, teasingly waving the pouch in front of him. "No clue, Marky. Jerker is the one who stole it," she said abruptly with a shrug of her shoulders. Mark rolled his eyes before looking at the screen displaying the bus times, seeing they still had a while before the bus they needed to get on left. "Marky," Harley said in a soft voice from beside him. Mark turned and saw her with an uncharacteristically serious expression on her face. "When you get your powers back, you won't leave me, right? I know I can be a bit crazy and hard to deal with. But it's been nice having you around. I don't want you to leave yet," she finished as she looked down to her feet. For a while Mark doesn't answer, and it makes Harley feel a pang of pain in her heart. But she suddenly feels his hand on her head. "I guess I was kinda responsible for blowing up your house. So I'll have to stick around with you till I can pay you back," he said as she looked up at him. "Though I don't have a job at the moment, so I may have to hang around you for a while," he said with a grin. Harley burst into laughter and jumped on him, hugging him tightly. "Good. Now go get me some more vodka and juice," she said. Nolan floated in place with a smirk as he stared down Superman. He rolled his shoulders, clicking his bones. It's been a while since I've had a proper fight. That little Kryptonian wasn't even enough to call a warm-up, he said as he finished stretching. But now that you're here I can get a good warm-up in before I tear your planet to pieces, he said with a smile. Superman frowned as his fists started to tighten. This doesn't need to happen again, Nolan. Think about your wife, your son and your unborn grandson, he said as he tried to reason with the Viltrumite. But it all seemed in vain as Nolan just grinned. My son is dead, is he not? And who was the one responsible? He replied mockingly as the Man of Steel felt an overwhelming amount of guilt surge inside him. Even though he knew he was under the influence of red kryptonite, he could still remember plunging his fist into Mark's back and throwing him into the harbor. Your son's death shouldn't have happened, but think about what you're doing. Your wife still misses you. She has waited over 10 years despite knowing your true nature, Superman said, and for a microsecond, he thought he saw an expression other than arrogance and contempt, but it quickly disappeared. The Viltrum Empire will make Earth a better place. Look at how they starve, murder, and profit off each other's death. This world is a disgusting place that needs to be overhauled, Nolan said in a disgusted voice. Cal, you may have grown up among these animals, but you know better than anyone their limitations. They will never go beyond what they are now on their own. They need our help, he continued firmly. But it seemed none of his words would sway the Kryptonian very well then, he said as he clenched his fists. Nolan zoomed toward Superman, throwing a punch that landed directly into his face. As Superman was sent flying backwards, he couldn't help but be surprised at the speed and power behind the attack. It was stronger than before. He stopped himself before racing back towards Nolan and throwing a punch of his own which Nolan deftly caught. Superman tried to blast him with his heat vision, but Nolan grabbed him by the face and spun around before throwing him towards the space station. Superman managed to stop himself just before he hit to, but it didn't make any difference as Nolan was already in front of him, flying into him with a powerful kick that sent him through the watchtower and out the other end. Superman, you need to get him to these coordinates. You won't be able to take him alone, Superman heard over the earpiece. He had easier said than done, he thought to himself as he saw Nolan flying through the hole that was made. Superman rushed towards him with his eyes blazing red as he shot his heat vision at Nolan. The Viltrumite put his hand up to block it, but as Superman appeared in front of him, he grabbed Nolan's outstretched hand and dragged him forward before punching him in the stomach and making him grunt. He then clasped his hands together and sledgehammered him on his back, sending him flying through space. Nolan growled and they both flew back towards each other. They clashed together, both struggling to overpower the other before Nolan headbutt him and kneed him in the stomach. But as he went to right hook Superman's jaw, the Man of Steel caught his fist and spun around at super speeds before letting him go and throwing him towards the Earth. He then raced after Nolan and grabbed his midsection, flying them into the atmosphere of the Earth. They both started to catch fire as they entered the atmosphere. Nolan slammed his fists against Superman's back as they plummeted down to the Earth. Superman grunted as fists pounded against his back, but he tightened his grip and kept flying them down towards the ground. Nolan growled and reached his arms around Superman's stomach and yanked him upwards. This loosened his grip and sent them both spiraling away from each other. Nolan flew straight towards Superman, grabbing him by the throat as he continued the dive that he started. He punched Superman repeatedly as he flew them both down to the ground. Every punch was like a strike of lightning as booming sounds echoed out each time his fist connected with his face. Superman felt his nose crunch and blood splatter across his face and Nolan's fist as he was continually pummeled. Slamming his fist down on Nolan's arm, he loosened the man's grip around his throat, and he then blasted him with his heat vision. As they fell, they both pummeled each other, neither letting the other stop the momentum they were gaining as they increasingly got closer to the ground. You struggle for these animals. But it'll all be in vain, Nolan shouted as he got behind Superman, wrapping his cape around his head and pushing him down at his top speed towards the ground. Superman managed to struggle out of his cape, but Nolan had a solid grip on him from behind. These people are so much more than animals. You'll see, Superman said, coughed out. Nolan frowned at his words but ignored him. The next moment he'd just been punched in the face by someone new and was launched away from Superman. He spun around in the air and felt himself get grabbed by this new person, Shazam. Agh, Nolan shouted as he was struck with a bolt of lightning. He was then thrown towards the ground where he was kicked again, only this time it was someone else. This new person kicked him, and then he felt something tighten around his neck as he was once again flung towards the ground. Boom! Nolan hits the ground with the force of a large bomb, making a crater half a mile in size. He growls as he lifts himself from the crater and floats above, staring at the people that now surround him. So the whole League is here, the Earth's mightiest defenders, and they can't take down a single Viltrumite alone, he said with amusement. Surrounding Nolan were the founding members of the League with a few other heavy hitters. Batman called in Shazam, as he was nearly on the same level as Superman if not for his childish personality. Superboy was also present as Batman wanted to make sure they neutralized him quickly. Batman to the League. Superman will take the lead. The rest of you act as support and give him as many openings as you can, Batman said through a comm channel. Nolan looked around. What? No Batman? I was looking forward to tearing his spine out through his body. Though this situation reeks of his involvement, he said with a growl. Superman flew up in front of him while Shazam and Wonder Woman flew to his sides, and Martian Manhunter and Green Lantern were behind him. Down below stood Aquaman with Superboy and Flash. They all prepared to engage and take down Nolan. Nolan looked at them and smirked. There is only one person here worth my time. Tell me, what would you do without your precious Superman, he said mockingly. Last time you caught me off guard and took me out before I had a chance to get started, but not this time. No, this time I'll finish things for good, he said as he reached into his mouth. Superman heard the crack as Nolan removed one of his teeth. He then sped down to the ground, slamming his fist down, creating a shockwave that knocked back Aquaman and Superboy, though Flash was able to get back in time. Superman sped down, drawing his fist down for a bunch, but Nolan looked up at him and smirked. Palming the tooth he had pulled out using enough strength to cause a sonic boom, he launched it at Superman, who thought he'd just power through it. However, he found himself growing weak and falling from the sky as he skipped across the ground. Superman. They all shouted as they rushed towards them, only for Nolan to clap his hands together, making a shockwave that forced them back. Nolan sped over to Superman and looked down at the Man of Steel, who had a small hole in his chest. I implanted the kryptonite in my mouth as soon as I discovered who you were. You're feeling it, how aren't you? The weakness these monkeys feel every day, Nolan said as he kicked Clark in the stomach, launching him away and out of the crater. He then turned back around to the rest of the League and smirked at them. Now then, who's next? Boom! The empty plains they were in were now a wasteland as their fight continued across the land. Hal, watch out! Diana shouted, but it was too late as Nolan flew up behind him and sledgehammered his back, sending him to the ground. Diana flew towards Nolan with her sword out as she swung her sword at him. Nolan caught the blade in his hand, and although it made him bleed, it wasn't enough to hurt him. He dragged her forward and slammed his fist into her face, sending her flying backwards. At that moment, Superboy jumped from the ground and grabbed him from behind, hoping to be able to restrain him. Now Shazam! He shouted as the hero flew in and delivered a rapid combo to Nolan. The Viltrumite got increasingly mad before yelling out in anger and smashing his head into Connor's face, breaking his nose, and then grabbing him by the arm and using him to smash Shazam down to the ground. He flew down after him and proceeded to beat Shazam using Connor as a weapon. Nolan then felt himself get hit in the back of the head. He turned around and it happened again. And again, and then all of a sudden he was being hit at sonic speeds. He could see the Flash running around him and hitting him, so he spun in the opposite direction, creating an opposing force. As soon as Flash slowed down enough, Nolan zoomed towards him, tackling him to the ground, and before the Flash could phase out of his grasp, Nolan smashed his leg, shattering his kneecap. Flashes. Screams were muffled by Nolan as he picked him up by his head and started to squeeze. Flash tried punching him but found his punches weren't effective. However, before Nolan could crush his head, he was grabbed from behind by John, who shape-shifted his hand into a large version and threw him through the sky. John punched Nolan again and again, launching him further and further away. Hal joined him a moment later, using a large green bat to slam him down. Before Nolan could reach the ground, he was kicked by Shazam, who had recovered from his beating. In his left hand was Arthur, who he threw right at Nolan. Nolan shouted as Arthur pierced him with his trident. They both landed on the floor, where Arthur removed his trident and lifted it up to do it again. However, Nolan pulled his feet out from under him, sending the King of Atlantis tumbling to the floor. He grabbed him by the neck and lifted him in front of him. Boom! Nolan smashed his head right into Arthur's face, sending the man into a daze. Boom boom crack! The sounds of bones breaking could be heard as Arthur's nose and skull cracked and shattered. He pushed the Atlantean off of him before grabbing his trident. Shazam, who was the fastest of them all, saw what was about to happen, and his eyes widened. No! Don't do it, he shouted as he flew as fast as he could towards him. But it was too late as Nolan slammed Arthur's trident through his stomach, and it went out through his back as he pierced the ground beneath them. He then spat on him right before turning to Shazam and smirking, "I'll make you pay," he shouted as he clashed with Nolan, sending them tumbling across the grounds. Shazam threw a punch that Nolan avoided and then reciprocated with his own. This one managed to catch Shazam in the stomach, but he managed to push the pain down and catch Nolan's next punch. He then turned around and swung him into the ground and then released a barrage of lightning, making the man growl in pain. Hal and the others who were still in the fight arrived and immediately saw Arthur. "John, can you do anything?" Diana asked as she checked his pulse. John shook his head. "I'm afraid I cannot do anything here. He needs equipment that is only available in a few places," he stated solemnly. "Then get him there," she shouted before standing up and carefully removing the trident from the ground. Arthur thought she had to drop it after, as the trident does not accept those who aren't of royal Atlantean blood. John immediately grabbed Arthur and his body morphed, filling up the holes that were in his body. However, before flying off he looked at Diana. "Go, we will be fine," she said confidently before heading back into the fray. Nolan slowly got up, trying to overcome the barrage of lightning. But before he could lunge at Shazam, he was shot from behind by Hal, who had created a minigun with his ring. They were both giving it all they could to restrain him, but Nolan managed to push off his feet and tackle Shazam, ending the lightning attack. He then flipped over him and held Shazam in direct line of fire of Hal, who accidentally shot at his teammate's shit, he said before dismissing the construct. Nolan threw Shazam at Hal, and they both smacked into each other. However, he quickly had to dodge a rapid series of punches and kicks launched at him from Diana. Nolan smirked at her. "You would have made a good incubation chamber," he said as he punched her in the face, sending her skidding back slightly. She wiped the blood away from her lips. "They made a mistake letting you live 10 years ago. It is one I shall rectify for the good of the world," she said before charging back at him. Diana stopped trying to defend herself and let herself get hit with blow after blow, but she rained just as many hits on Nolan in their slugfest. Though Nolan was much stronger, and eventually Diana couldn't hold her ground any longer as she got punched backwards. However, Shazam caught her and placed her on her feet. Hal flew next to them as well, and they all faced off against Nolan. "I hope you're all ready to die together, but feel honored that on your bones will be built the foundation of a better future under the Empire," Nolan said as he floated up. It started to rain heavily, and lightning began hitting the ground around the all. Mayorarchy, Harley moaned in this ear, making him groan in annoyance. How is she such a lightweight? Mark thought to himself as he sat down at the bus stop with Harley shaking him, trying to climb on top of him again. "Mayorarchy," she moaned once again as she tried to straddle his waist. Mark just sighed. "What do you want, Harley?" he asked as he looked at her. She looked at him with a quivering lip. "You think I'm pretty, right?" she asked in a soft voice as she leaned her head on his shoulder. Mark just rolled his eyes. "Yes, Harley, I think you're pretty. You happy now?" he asked. Harley smiled brightly and giggled. "Yeah," she said before lying down on the bench and placing her head in Mark's lap. "Sleepy time. Wake me when food or fight," she said before immediately falling asleep. Mark looked down at the lunatic and chuckled before running his hands through her hair. His thoughts were drawn to Kara and whether what Superman had said before was true. Thinking about it made his stomach feel a bit queasy, but if it was true he needed to see her soon, a baby, he thought to himself. Though honestly he shouldn't feel surprised since he'd been finishing inside her every opportunity he got. However, before he could think about it any further, he saw a bunch of people gathering around a public TV in the bus station. Feeling a little bit curious, he gently placed Harley onto the bench before standing up and walking over to the screen. Shazam, Green Lantern, and Wonder Woman seemed to be engaged in a deadly fight with a villain. And my god, they seem to be losing. From what our researchers have gathered, the man they are fighting is the hero Omni-Man who went missing over 10 years ago. The real question on everyone's mind is, where is Superman and who is going to stop this titan of strength? The crowd gasped and muttered as they watched the news and saw Omni-Man send Wonder Woman through multiple buildings before punching Green Lantern into the ground. Mark just stood there with a blank expression on his face. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It had been so long, and yet there he was. It wasn't hard to see which city they were in, as he grew up in it after all. He immediately ran out of the station. "Come on, please work," he thought to himself as he launched himself off the ground with his feet jumping high into the air. However, he didn't fly. Landing on the ground and cracking it, he did it again, jumping even higher than before, but still landing on the ground. He then pressed both his hands to the ground and calmed himself before pushing off with all his strength, creating a small crater behind him. He shouted as he shot off through the air, finally being able to fly again. Nolan walked over to Shazam, who sent a lightning bolt to him, which he just took heed in. He then grabbed his outstretched hand and squeezed before mounting him and punching him repeatedly and smashing his face bloody. Shazam! Nolan quickly grabbed Shazam and held him up to the sky to intercept the lightning bolt that had shot his way. It hit Shazam, and when the smoke cleared he was no longer there, and in Nolan's grasp was Billy Baterson. "They get younger every year," Nolan said with a chuckle. He set Billy down on the ground but covered his mouth as soon as he tried to shout. He chopped Billy on the back of his neck with enough power to sever his spinal cord. Billy fell to the ground like a puppet having his strings cut. Shazam! Hal shouted as he rushed towards Nolan, a giant fist construct being sent towards him. Nolan shot towards it and broke through it before grabbing Hal's arm and tearing it off his body. Hal screamed in pain before he was interrupted by Nolan smacking him away with his own arm. Nolan smiled as he turned towards the last warrior who was struggling to stand on top of a building. She was breathing heavily and was bruised all over her entire body. Nolan flew down towards her. His own body had suffered quite a lot of damage over the course of the fight, but Viltrumites would keep fighting even when their guts were hanging out. "Even if we fail, others will not," Diana breathed out as she stood on shaky legs. Nolan landed in front of her and swiped away a weak punch from her before grabbing her by the throat. He grabbed her lasso of truth from around her belt, tied it around her neck, and flexed his muscles. Diana weakly tried pushing him away, but it was in vain as he only started tightening even further. Diana felt battered and bruised. Her body didn't have any more fight left in it, and she let her arms fall limply by her sides. However, he was distracted when he was grabbed by the back of his neck and thrown across the building away from Diana. Diana breathed a deep breath as she fell to the ground. Her vision was blurry, but when she made out who the person that saved him was, she was in shock. "Dad, we need to talk." Mark and Nolan stood facing each other on the building in utter silence after Mark had uttered those words. The only sounds were those from the streets below, as people still screamed and cars honked their horns trying to get away from the epicenter of the fight. "Dad." Mark flew at Nolan and hugged him tightly, which Nolan accepted with open arms and even laughed a bit. Diana, who was breathing heavily on the floor, watched as father and son embraced each other, and any hope she felt before Mark's arrival was quickly shattered. Nothing was stopping them now from calling down a full Viltrumite invasion. Nolan pulled away from the hug and smiled at his son. "It truly makes me happy that rumors of your death were exaggerated," he said as he had his arms on Mark's shoulders. Mark smiled back and nodded. "It was a close thing, but I managed to survive." "Dad, where have you been all this time?" Mark asked as he lost the smile on his face. Nolan sighed. 10 years ago the Justice League managed to get the drop on me. I underestimated them and it cost me years of freedom. But that doesn't matter. I am free now and you are alive and your powers have come in," he said as he clapped him on the back. Mark nodded as they walked to the edge of the building overlooking the city. "What are your plans now that you've escaped?" He then looked at the broken and bruised bodies of the League on the roof. "I don't think the Justice League will be much of a problem anymore," he commented. Nolan nodded. "Mark, how much do you know about yourself? And your powers?" he asked. Mark shrugged. "Not much. I know I'm an alien. And something called a Viltrumite," he responded, getting a nod from Nolan. "The reason I came to this planet was to prepare it to join the Empire. I was going to wait until you'd reached adulthood and your powers had come in so that the transition would be easier, but the League caught me digging around and you know what happened after that." Diana tried to push herself up to her feet as she listened to Mark and Nolan talk. They lost against Nolan. They wouldn't stand a chance against both of them. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew she needed to do something. She looked across the roof and saw Billy, who was still limp on the roof with only his eyes and mouth moving. Diana reached for her communicator, which was on her waist, but as she did, Nolan was already in front of her, and he grabbed her wrist, tightly squeezing, which made her scream. "They'll thank us, Mark. Everything new is tough at first, but when they see how we transform this shit-stained planet into something great, they'll thank us," he said as he kept squeezing. Diana looked at Mark, who had an emotionless look on his face as he looked at her bruised form. "Was this always the plan, Dad?" "To take control?" Mark asked in a calm tone. "Of course," he said before looking up at Mark's face. He dropped Diana roughly on the ground. "Mark, don't feel sorry for these people. Didn't they hunt you down like a dog just for being my son? They aren't worth your sympathy," Nolan stated firmly. Mark looked down at Diana. "You're right. They aren't. None of what they've done over the past few months is what I grew up believing heroes should do," he simply said, making Nolan smile and nod his head. Mark then turned to his dad and smiled. "But there are a lot of people who are worth it," Mark said as he thought about everyone in Gotham who had helped him get to this point. "If it wasn't for them, I might not even be here," he thought to himself. Nolan's smile faded. "So it's like that then?" he simply said as he stood there, and Mark nodded resolutely. "You never had any intention of joining me." "Why even let me talk?" he asked. Mark smiled at him. "I've missed you so much, Dad. These years without you were hard on me and Mom. So I just wanted to talk to you, even if it was just one last time," he replied. He then approached the shocked Nolan and embraced him once again before letting him go. Nolan's shock quickly vanished from his face, and he frowned. "Is that the way it is?" he said to Mark. Mark nodded before clenching his fists and holding them out in front of him. "Yeah, that's the way it is," he said. Nolan shook his head in disappointment. "Very well then," he said before blitzing toward Mark, drawing his fist back, which connected with his face, launching Mark off the building and through multiple skyscrapers. Mark heard the screaming of people as he smashed into the ground, creating a massive grove in the ground as he rolled across the road. He flipped around and dug his hands into the ground to stop his momentum. Once he stopped moving across the ground, he touched his hand to his face and winced slightly. "I'm in crap," he said to himself before he pushed back on his feet and flew backwards, narrowly avoiding Nolan slamming down on the road, feet first, creating a massive shockwave that shattered all the glass in the area and flipped over the cars. Mark silently cursed as he looked around. He wasn't a hero, and he never would be, but it didn't mean he was heartless enough to let thousands die in their fight. He flew towards Nolan, swinging his arm low and going for an uppercut. Nolan easily leaned away from the hit but was caught when Mark brought his arm back down, hitting Nolan in the face with his elbow. Unfortunately, it only made him budge slightly. "Is that it?" he asked as he stood there unamused. Mark smirked, however, and increased the weight of his arm to its max. The force combined with the weight was able to slam Nolan down to the ground. Mark then grabbed Nolan by the ankle and spun him around several times before flinging him up into the air. Mark flew up into the air after him, slamming his fist into his stomach and sending him up further. However, when Mark tried to do it again, Nolan caught his fist and sent a powerful right hook aimed at his face. Mark leaned back horizontally, avoiding the hook before bringing his feet up and slamming them into Nolan's stomach, sending him back slightly. However, he still had Mark's fist in his grip, so he was dragged with him. It gave Nolan the opportunity to draw his fist back and slam it into Mark's stomach, sending blood spurting from his mouth. Nolan went to do it again, but Mark kicked out and sent his fist careening upwards. He then slammed his elbow down on Nolan's arm, which managed to loosen his grip before doing a spinning punch which caught Nolan in the face. Nolan smirked as he wiped a small bit of blood off his mouth. Mark, you will never be satisfied among these people. They will never understand you. And when the weak can't understand something, they fear it, he stated in a serious tone before rushing forward and punching him through the sky. You are wasting your life on this backwater planet, he said as he grabbed him by the throat and flew straight down. Mark struggled as he tried to get out of his father's grasp. But he couldn't, and in a matter of seconds he was slammed into a skyscraper and through every single floor before Nolan threw him into the lobby of the building. You want to live your life in the slaughterhouse with the rest of the animals, fine, he said as he landed in front of Mark and kicked him in the stomach, sending him sliding across the lobby and through one of the supporting pillars. I don't need you. I can just wait for that baby of yours to grow up and dash. Boom. Nolan was sent up through multiple floors before he felt himself get grabbed and then slammed back down to the lobby. He looked up and saw Mark with a pissed off look on his face as he floated down and landed in front of him. I couldn't bring myself to give it my all. I suppose I'm still somewhat in disbelief at what's happening. But that won't be a problem anymore, he said ominously as he looked towards Nolan with his fist outstretched. Nolan stood up and scowled. You're such a disappointment. All of that power and you're wasting it protecting ants. He spat as he sped towards him, throwing a punch. Mark narrowly avoided the punch by sidestepping it and then throwing one of his own which connected with Nolan's chin, snapping his head back. Mark then sent a powerful punch into Nolan's stomach, the collision of which managed to cause a shockwave. He followed up with a spinning elbow to the face and then flew up and brought both hands together and sledge-hammered him to the ground. Mark then went to grab him, but his wrist was caught by Nolan. If that's all you have, then maybe you deserve to die along with these creatures, he growled out as he floated up and lifted Mark before smashing him into the ground multiple times. He then threw him into the air up multiple floors and followed with a series of rapid punches that were aimed at his recently healed stomach. Mark eventually hit the ground in what looked like an office floor, and he threw up a good amount of blood as he grasped his stomach in pain. Though he didn't have much time to recover as Nolan was already before him with his foot drawn back. Mark crossed his arms to protect himself and grunted as the kick sent him sailing through the office cubicles and the wall of the building outside. Mark floated outside the building as he looked inside to where Nolan was. He saw Nolan start to fly towards him and he got ready. When Nolan launched to punch his way, he shifted his body and caught the arm before throwing him upwards. Let's see how you deal with this, Mark thought to himself as he lifted his hand in the direction of Nolan, who had stopped his momentum and was now heading back towards Mark. Sparks flew as a sphere of red came into existence in his palm, and just before Nolan got close enough, he launched the ball that was the size of an apple. It caused a huge shock wave which shattered the glass of the surrounding building. Mark managed to hear Nolan sputter as the wind was knocked out of him, and he was sent back upwards with a sphere of pure repel. Mark flew up and followed him into the sky, and just before the ball winked out of existence, Mark connected a spinning kick which he weighted to Nolan's jaw, which sent him across the sky. Nolan eventually stopped himself and was in pure shock as he looked at his son who was approaching him. How did you do that? He growled out as his expression turned severe. Mark raised an eyebrow at him. I've had those powers since before my Viltrumite powers kicked in. It's something some humans are born with. But you know this, so why bother asking? Mark asked with some confusion. Nolan looked thoughtful for a moment before looking at his son. It seems plans have changed. You may be content to waste your life on this planet, but I won't allow one of the only true Viltrumite hybrids in existence to do so. I'll be taking you back to the Empire. Your compliance isn't necessary, Nolan growled out as he got ready to attack once more. Mark held his hand out and sent a wave of repel aimed at Nolan before following up with a sledgehammer straight to his chest. He then reached out to his other hand and pulled him back towards him with his power and sent a weighted punch straight to his face. Nolan was sent hurtling to the ground as the punch had dazed him slightly. But as he started to slow himself down, another red sphere was sent hurtling at him, which caught him in the chest again at GH. He grunted as he tried to grasp the ball and move it out of the way, but his hand couldn't fully grasp it as if it pushed him away the closer he tried to get. Boom! Nolan slammed into the ground, creating a massive crater. He growled as the ball hadn't disappeared and was still pushing him deeper into the ground. Eventually, it dissipated and Nolan shot out of the hole floating above the large crater only to be drop-kicked by Mark, sending him back to the ground. They were outside the city now, so Mark didn't have to worry about destroying it. Mark landed on the ground just as Nolan stood up. It was pretty disheartening to see how uninjured he looked with only a few bruises on his face, but Mark wouldn't give up so easily. Mark shot a blue sphere at Nolan, but this time his dad zoomed out of the way, avoiding it, and then towards Mark. But Mark smirked as Nolan drew his fist back, only for it to be halted by the blue sphere that was behind him. Mark took advantage and slammed his fist into Nolan multiple times, mirroring a Wing Chun combination that he'd seen Ted practice a few times. He ended by kicking Nolan in the stomach towards the blue sphere that ground against his back and caused him to scowl. With a bit of effort, he shook himself free and away from its attraction, only to be grabbed by Mark and slammed into the ground. Mark punched him multiple times in the face before charging up a red sphere in his hand and slamming it down in Nolan's face point blank. Boom! Mark was forced back from the explosion of his red sphere and hit the ground just outside the crater that they'd formed. For a moment everything was silent, and Mark breathed a sigh of relief as he thought it might be over, but his hopes were immediately dashed as he saw his father floating out of the hole in the ground. His face was red and some of the skin had managed to tear off. Needless to say, he was not happy enough. He said, and the next second he was in front of Mark, who tried to throw a punch at him, but it was brushed aside before Nolan returned one of his own that hit him in the face hard enough to break his nose and send him careening across the ground. Nolan sped off ahead of Mark and caught him by the back of his neck. He then flew with him in hand and slammed his head into the ground, dragging him across it. Mark tried to loosen his grip, but it was all in vain. Nolan then lifted him before bringing his face to his knee multiple times and throwing him gently in the air before launching a powerful kick at his body, which made his body break the sound barrier as it was launched across the sky and back into the city. Mark tried to slow himself down, but by the time he did, he had slammed through multiple buildings before rolling into the street. He was dazed and his vision was blurred. His nose was broken and his orbital socket felt like it had been fractured. However, he wasn't given any reprieve as Nolan was already there lifting him from the ground. "You have no clue how special you are, and yet you'd rather waste away on this planet," Nolan growled out as he lifted him by the back of his neck. "Tell me, what has you so enamored with these humans?" he shouted as he slammed his head down to the ground again. He then floated over to one of the people who were watching the fight and grabbed him by the throat. "Look at them, Mark. You may think they look like us," he said as he looked at him. He then clenched his fist and crushed the man's throat, immediately ending his life. "But they aren't like us," he continued. Mark breathed heavily as he stood up. "Stop it." He breathed out as he flew towards Nolan and sent a few punches at him. Nolan just avoided them with a speed much faster than he used before. He then sent a punch into Mark's stomach, which sent him to the ground as he threw up once again. Nolan grabbed one of the people who tried to run away and lifted them up by the leg. With a grin on his face, he used her as a makeshift weapon and slammed her into Mark. Mark just kneeled there in disbelief as he felt her warm blood splatter all over him as her body was torn in half after making contact with his own. Nolan then grabbed Mark by the hair and dragged him onto the pavement before throwing him through the crowd of people who were running away. His invulnerable body tore through the people, splattering their blood and body parts across the pavement. Nearly the entire street was covered in people's blood. If Mark had anything left, he might have thrown up again, but all he could do was look on in sheer horror as he saw over 100 people dead in an instant. Mark was on his knees when Nolan approached him and kicked him in the face, sending him through the air and into an apartment building. He struggled up and pushed himself up against the wall, seeing he was in one of the low-income houses. A woman came running into the room and screaming as she saw the bloody and battered form of Mark. She immediately ran to a crib and grabbed her baby, but before she could run out of the room, Nolan had floated in through the hole. He drew his arm back and slapped her, which sent her brains splattering across the wall. Her baby started crying as it was dropped to the floor. Mark tried to rush and catch it, but he was roughly shoved back by Nolan. Squelch! Mark heard the baby abruptly stop crying, but he didn't dare look down. He just looked up at Nolan with anger on his face. Nolan looked back at him with a small grin. "What, did I step in something?" he asked. He quickly avoided a punch by Mark before grabbing his arm and punching him in the face multiple times before sending him flying out the wall into the streets below. He follows suit and lands on the ground below, watching Mark crawling out of the small crater he'd formed. "I'm doing this for your own good, Mark. You'll thank me for it one day, whether in 100 or 1,000 years from now, when everyone you know has turned to dust and I'm the only one you have left," he said as he approached Mark, who struggled to his feet. Mark didn't know what to do. Nothing he did worked. It felt like he was fighting Superman after he stopped holding back, and he remembered well enough how that ended. However, he still stood up and held his fists out. "What else can I do?" he thought to himself. His dad was capable of destroying everything, and he would before turning everyone on the planet into slaves. But as Nolan edged closer to him, in the corner of his eye, Mark saw a grate to the sewers start to shift, and abruptly it burst open along with a large amount of the concrete surrounding it. Nolan felt surprised as he felt large-scaled arms wrapped tightly around him as well as a large tail run. Mark, the creature said in a rumbling snake-like voice. Mark's eyes widened as he saw Waylon wrap himself around Nolan to stop him from taking him, but he knew Waylon didn't stand a chance against his dad. Waylon, no, stop! He shouted as he rushed towards them. Nolan looked annoyed as he slammed his head back and into the chest of Waylon, who grunted as he felt his bones snap. Nolan then opened his arms out, forcing Waylon off of him, and turned around to end the man's life. However, before he could, Mark managed to halt him by grabbing his arm and stopping it, but Nolan pulled Mark closer before headbutting him and then slamming his fist into his face, launching him away further into the city. He then looked back to Waylon, who snarled at him. Waylon charged at him, slashing at him with his claws, but then quickly grunted in pain as he felt them snap on his skin. Nolan grabbed the offending hand and snapped his wrist before pulling him closer and grabbing his jaws with his hands. Waylon struggled against Nolan to get free but failed, and his lower jaw was ripped off. Nolan then kicked him in the chest, sending him through multiple buildings, before turning around and trying to find Mark. Mark woke up with a gasp as he realized he must have passed for a second. He looked around and helplessly laughed, discovering he was on the same building they had originally met on. He looked and saw Wonder Woman had passed out again. He didn't blame her, as he very much felt like passing out right now as well. His guilt grew as he saw a boy on the roof as well. The boy was looking at him and mouthing something, but his mouth seemed to be filled with blood. Mark crawled over to him and tipped the boy on his side. Blood poured out of his mouth, and Mark could see how his spine looked crunched. Mark felt guilt overwhelm him. "I'm sorry," was all he could think to say, and it only got worse when the boy smiled at him. He tried to speak, but struggled to stop. "Just rest and we'll get you some help soon," Mark lied. There was no help coming. Not for him, not for Wonder Woman, not for Mark. Hand. He heard the boy whisper out. Mark obliged and grabbed his hand as he assumed he didn't want to die alone or something similar, but he then felt his hand start to tingle as electricity started to run all over it. He tried to move his hand away, but it felt stuck in place. He looked down at the boy, who was still smiling. The last thing Mark heard was Shazam. As Nolan flew across the skyline of the city, suddenly a large lightning bolt struck one of the buildings, which caused him to frown. He zoomed across until he arrived at the roof to see it was covered in smoke. All of a sudden, a lightning bolt emerged from the smoke and struck him in the chest, sending him back into the building behind him. As he stood up, he saw Mark, who looked to have recovered from his beating, fly in through the hole, though he was currently wearing the outfit Shazam had, and blue electricity dancing across his body. Mark felt good. He felt even better than he did when he first got his powers, though he didn't much like the outfit. As soon as he said that, lightning washed across his body and the costume changed. He was wearing his regular clothes again, but they were all patched up and not blood-stained. He looked at Nolan, who had a shocked and slightly enraged expression on his face. Mark looked back with an equally angry expression. "Bell hasn't rung yet." Superman. Clark. Clark opened his eyes and was greeted by the night sky, and to the left of him was Bruce in a heavily armored version of his costume. "Bruce, what happened?" he asked, but as he did, he felt a wave of nausea overcome him. His body felt heavy and his chest was in a lot of pain. He looked down and saw blood covering the S symbol on his chest, and a small hole in the center. "Clark, stay calm. It seems Nolan had kept a piece of kryptonite in his mouth and he shot it inside you. We need to take you to Star Labs so they can remove it," Bruce stated calmly, though Clark could hear a hint of desperation in his voice. Clark felt his eyes start to close and he was about to drift off when Bruce slapped his face. "Stay awake. We need you, Clark. If you die, then we won't be able to stop Nolan," he stated. This sobered Clark up enough to stay awake as Bruce carried him to his jet. Clark tried to stay awake, but his eyes shut and he drifted off into the void, maybe never to wake up again. Mark stood tall in front of Nolan with electricity dancing around his form. He shot towards Nolan a lot faster than he was before, grabbing him by the face and flying him through the building and then onto the streets, where he dragged his face along the ground. He then lifted him and threw him to the sky, where he shot a bolt of lightning at him, sending him further away. Nolan growled and righted himself before flying at Mark and throwing a punch that he avoided and quickly returned one of his own, which caught Nolan in the jaw. Nolan blocked the next punch Mark threw and sent one directly into his stomach, sending him hurtling through the air. Mark grunted, but it didn't hurt as much as it did before. He smiled manically as he charged lightning throughout his body and shot it towards Nolan in a continuous beam, which Nolan struggled to block as he held his hand out in front of him. Mark flew towards him as he shot the beam, and when he got close he stopped and instead launched a left hook at Nolan, followed by an uppercut. Mark slammed his fists into him one after the other. He had the satisfaction of watching blood spray out of Nolan's mouth, letting him know that his punches were doing a bit more than tickling him. These abilities were amazing, not only the strength, speed and endurance, but the wisdom and power that came with it. He had so many crazy insights into how to use his powers, both the new electrical ones and his gravity ones. Mark leaned back, avoiding a swing from Nolan before bringing his foot up and kicking under his chin, sending him spinning. This isn't just lightning, he thought to himself as he let up his palm with blue electricity dancing over it. Its power, he thought before creating a red sphere in his hand the size of a fist. But then all of a sudden lightning ran through it, and it expanded, growing even larger, almost to the size of a boulder. He then threw it towards Nolan, who was still spinning. After righting himself, he looked at the approaching red sphere and spits before crossing his arms together, taking on the challenge. H, he screamed as a large explosion occurred at the point of impact. He was forced back through the skies as he struggled against the ball. His arms started to ache and creak before it finally disappeared. He floated high in the sky, looking down at where Mark was in absolute rage. While he was proud of his son, he was using his power for all the wrong reasons. He zoomed back down with a sonic boom, flying straight towards Mark, who was still floating mid the air. Nolan knew they were about even for power and speed now, but his other powers put him at a disadvantage. Time to brush off my old fighting skills, he thought to himself as he avoided bolts of lightning being shot at him. He drew his fist back into a punch, which made Mark get ready to block it, but Nolan threw the punch early and used the momentum to roll and deliver a nasty kick to the side of Mark's head, sending him flying towards the ground. He shot after him, pushing himself to go beyond his top speed, and collided with him. They both slammed into the ground, creating a massive shockwave. Nolan, who was on top of Mark, started punching Mark in the face, pounding him into the ground. When Mark tried to hold his hand up to shoot a bolt at him, Nolan grabbed it and moved it away so he'd missed before sending a devastating punch to Mark's face, which sent rock and dirt exploding outwards. You think your little tricks can beat thousands of years of pure evolution? Nolan shouted as slammed his fist down once again, sending another shockwave. That it can beat thousands of years of battle experience. You are merely an infant compared to me, he shouted as he grabbed him by the head and slammed him on the ground again and again. Mark was blinded by his own blood squirting onto his face, though he couldn't wipe it away as Nolan was relentless in slamming him into the ground. However, he managed to get his feet in front of him and stop being slammed. He then twisted around and sent a quick punch to his stomach. Nolan took the punch, only letting out a grunt, and in return, he threw a punch connecting under Mark's chin and sending him skidding across the ground. He flipped around midair and shot several bolts of lightning as Nolan flew after him. As Nolan reached him, he drew back his fist and sent a punch that Mark turned into and then flipped Nolan over his shoulder and to the ground. He followed up by kicking him in the stomach, launching him further. They both flew back at each other and collided, causing a massive shockwave as they grappled each other's hands, trying to overpower one another. The ground started to crack at the strength they were exuding. Mark leaned back, allowing Nolan to overpower him, but as Nolan did, he overextended his body, and Mark took advantage of this by sending a knee straight to his chin. He then bringing his other leg up and altering its weight before slamming it down on his head, bringing him to the ground and removing his grip from him. Mark breathed heavily as he grabbed Nolan by the neck and held him up above himself. Shazam! A large bolt of lightning descended from the sky and hit Nolan, causing him to growl in pain. Shazam! Another bolt descends, hitting Nolan right in the chest. But before Mark can do it again, Nolan twists and elbows him in the face, sending him back. Nolan then charges at Mark, grabbing him and shooting him off the ground into the air. They quickly reach the city, where Mark is flown through multiple buildings. He brings his hands up together and uses his powers to increase the weight before smashing Nolan's upper back and removing Mark from his grasp. They both crash through the building and into the streets once more, where they both stand side by side. You look like you're slowing down there, Dad, Mark said as he turned his head to look at him. Nolan chuckles slightly. You must be imagining it, he replied. They both swung at each other, and their fists clashed, shattering the glass around them and cracking the ground beneath their feet. You won't win, Mark. Viltrumites get stronger as they age, and I am thousands of years older than you, he said as he gritted his teeth. Mark, who was also struggling, smirked. I will win. And it won't be because of my Viltrumite powers, he said resolutely before electricity ignited around his body. He then grabbed Nolan's hand, inadvertently shocking him, and punched him in the face with his other lightning-infused fist again and again. The sound of thunder cracked with every punch, and he ended it by launching a powerful kick, sending him bouncing back down the street. Mark zoomed ahead of Nolan and clotheslined him before pulling him back with his power and throwing a rapid combo of punches and elbows that Nolan was too stunned to react to fast enough. Nolan eventually regained control and sent even stronger punches back at Mark, who attempted to go blow for blow with him. The shockwaves from their punches were shattering the ground around them and making the buildings rumble and glass shatter. Mark avoided a punch and slipped inside Nolan's guard before getting him with a vicious elbow. He then pivoted around him and kicked his knees out from him while grabbing his neck and holding him up. Shazam! Once again, a bolt of lightning is called down and strikes Nolan, making him grit his teeth as the lightning flowed through him. Shazam! Nolan twists out of his grip before punching Mark in the stomach and then holding him up to intercept the bolt. The bolt hits Mark and he suddenly feels his strength drain and turn back to normal. He also couldn't feel the other powers he had either. He swings his fist backwards, impacting Nolan's nose, and gets himself loose from his grip. Shaza-Gurg before he can transform again. Nolan punches him full force in the throat, rendering him unable to speak as he spits out blood and his muscles spasm. "Now what will you do, Mark?" Nolan said as he floated in front of him. He then sped forward and booted him through multiple buildings and into Wayne Tower. Mark, who still couldn't speak, stood up and found himself in some sort of lab. The people working in there started to panic as they saw Mark crash in through the window, and they all started to run out. "I meant what I said, Dad. I will beat you without my Viltrumite powers," he said telepathically to Nolan, who was floating in through the hole Mark had made. Nolan looked at Mark in amusement. "Oh, and what do you think your puny meta powers can do to me?" he said arrogantly before appearing in front of him and grabbing him by the throat. Mark tries to break the grip, but Nolan isn't playing around anymore, and so he lacks the strength to do it. This is gonna hurt, Mark thought to himself as he sent a widespread field of repelling force blasting out of his body. It blasts Nolan away, but as his grip was so solid he took a chunk of Mark's throat with him. Mark had also inadvertently destroyed a large part of the floor they were on, and it was starting to crumble. Grabbing his throat, he flew out of the building quickly. He hoped that no one else was there, but even that was unlikely. He landed back down on the street, and at the end he saw his father, who was up and ready to fight. "Dad," Mark said telepathically towards Nolan. "Mark, I wish I could have had those 10 years with you. Even if it all led to this in the end, I do too." Nolan charges forward towards Mark, who holds his hand up and sends another powerful wave, sending him back. "Now let's see if Solomon's wisdom was onto something," he thinks to himself as he moves his hands and holds them out to his side, summoning 2 spheres, one red and one blue. He drains himself, making them as big as he can, but can only make them to around half the size of the one he made earlier. Mark looks ahead and sees Nolan getting up and flying back towards him. 2 concentrated spheres of pure attraction and repel. It should be impossible to combine them, but it wouldn't be the weirdest thing that's happened when combined. The struggle for dominance in the center pulls the atoms apart, creating pure energy and ripping a hole in reality. Mark looks in front of him at the now purple sphere in front of him. He hesitates for a second, but when he thinks back to the damage that has been done by his father, he can't let him go free. "HHHHHH, Nolan shouted as he charged towards Mark, shattering the glass as he zooms past. "I wish things could be different. I love you, Dad." Mark sent the sphere shooting ahead with a shockwave and a small blast of repel to make it faster. Nolan smiles arrogantly as he holds his hand in front to smack the sphere away, but he suddenly gets a chill down his spine as the sphere gets closer. He looks at the ground and sees the concrete disappearing as it makes contact with the sphere. He finally realizes his mistake, but he's too late. Mark breathed heavily as Nolan is now right in front of him. His father is also tired and breathing heavily. "Looks like you were right." Nolan breathes out before coughing up blood. He looks down to his right side and sees his left arm and shoulder are completely gone. His ribcage at the side of his body is completely exposed and blood is pouring out. "Tell your mom I missed her," he said before falling to the ground. Mark feels his cheeks become wet with tears as he sees his dad dying on the ground. He wants to help, but as he takes a step forward he falls to the ground and finds his vision fading too. Both Mark and Nolan pass out next to each other on the destroyed street of Gotham. Diana woke up gasping for breath. She looked around and saw her heart immediately fell as what she was experiencing wasn't a dream. The last thing she remembers was Mark and Nolan embracing before she passed out once again. She pushed herself to her feet, feeling slightly recovered. Her eyes drifted and landed on Shazam, or Billy as he was known in this form. She stumbled over to him and fell to her knees next to his body. She didn't even need to check his pulse to see he was dead. His eyes were lifeless, but he did die with a smile on his face. "I am so sorry," she said with a voice full of pain as she cradled his body, but she couldn't think of him now. She stood up and floated upwards. She was shocked to see the devastation that had been brought upon Gotham. Did Cal come back? She thought to herself as she slowly flew through the city. She flew to Wayne Tower as it seemed like a large explosion had taken off a chunk of the tower. Once she got there she could see one of the streets had a large grove going down the center of it, all the way across the city and to the harbor. She looked down and her eyes widened as she saw 2 bloodied and battered people. She flew down as quickly as she could, believing one of them to be Superman. However, she was shocked when she saw that it was Mark and not Cal. She knelt by him and moved him onto her back, almost gasping at the damage he'd sustained. She placed her head against his chest, and she sighed in relief when she heard a slow heartbeat. She cupped his face with her hand as she felt the overwhelming guilt crashing down. They'd been hunting Mark relentlessly out of fear that he'd help his father take the planet. Yet they neglected to consider that he might have actually helped them move. She heard from beside her, She looked up and saw Nolan stumbling to his feet. Blood spewed out of his empty socket as he lumbered towards them. Diana stood up too, standing between them. "I won't let you hurt him," she said as she crouched protectively over him. "He's coming with me. He doesn't belong with you people," he stated. Diana clenched her fists. "I won't let you," she said weakly. Nolan chuckled weakly. "Even as I am now, I could crush you," he said with venom in his voice. Diana knew he was right, but she wouldn't give up. She struggled slightly, but stood up straight, ready to face him. However, before Nolan could take another step, the loud sound of a jet flying in above sounded around them. Out of the bottom of the jet came Batman, followed by Cyborg. "Stand down, Nolan," Batman said as he walked in his heavy armor next to Diana. Cyborg walked to her other side, forming a large cannon on his arm. "Agree to be taken into custody, and you'll be treated," Batman growled out as he palmed a sonic disruptor in his hand. Nolan laughed and spat on the floor. "I could take all three of you with one hand," he said before looking at Batman. "You barely even count as a threat." Batman looks at him stoically. "Maybe. But what about them?" he said, gesturing behind Nolan with his head. Hovering, there were both Supergirl and Starfire, looking very much angry and unimpressed. Supergirl's eyes were glowing red with anger as she saw how hurt Mark was. Nolan realized the predicament he was in and scowled. "This isn't over," he growled out before shooting off the ground and into the sky. Kara went to follow but was grabbed by Starfire. "Baby," she simply said, but it was enough to get Kara to calm down as she rubbed her stomach. She instead flew down to Mark and cradled his head as tears began to flow from her face. "Supergirl, he's still alive, but we need to get him to the watchtower for treatment," Batman said as he approached her. But as soon as he got close, he felt his armor start to heat up and she glared at him. However, when Corey placed a hand on her shoulder, she relented, and they took Mark to the jet to get him some medical attention. Yawn Harley stretched as she woke up on the bus station bench. She was quite dazed as she didn't remember when she fell asleep, though when she finally did start to remember, she scowled. "Damn Marky. He knows vodka and juice makes me tired," she said before standing up and looking around. The station was empty. Not Mark or anyone else was present. "That damn stupid face better not have left me again," she thought before walking to the wall-mounted TV and seeing the news coverage of what was happening in Gotham City. She snorted. "Place is a shithole anyway. A few dead bodies might actually cheer the place up a bit," she thought before walking off. She looked outside to see none of the buses were there. "What the hell? Well, what am I supposed to do now?" she complained. "Oh, don't worry. You won't need to take the bus. I'll give you a ride," she heard a voice behind her say. She tried to turn quickly while withdrawing her gun, but as she did, it was quickly knocked out of her hand and she was grabbed by the hair and slammed through the glass window into the bus terminal waiting room. She groaned as she got up. "Alrighty, Mr. Imma, mess you up," she said before silently cursing at the person in front of her. In orange and black armor, sporting a sword on his back, it was clear who this was. Deathstroke. Harley grinned. "So Mr. Baldy finally splashing out the big dollars on getting the package?" she asked. Deathstroke chuckled and shook his head. "Luther isn't the one who hired me. The one who did wants both the package and you. Thinks you'd both make quite a profit on the audition." Harley's eyes widen before she glares at him. "Yeah. Well, I ain't down yet, Buster. So don't th. Harley is hit from behind in the back of her head and she hits the floor. Deathstroke chuckles before hog-tying Harley and lifting her up sloppy. "You let her talk too much. Do better next time," he said, directed to the person who had knocked Harley out. "Yes, father," the person simply replied. Watchtower. 2 weeks later. Batman sat down in the seat that used to be Clark's, and gathered around the table were the founding members of the League that were still able to deploy. He looked around, seeing Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Cyborg and Martian Manhunter. He breathed in deeply before starting the meeting. "John, have you got anything to report?" he asked with a slightly defeated tone. He scratched his face, feeling the beard that had started to grow unchecked. John looked positively morose. "Arthur is still in a coma. The Atlanteans transported him back to Atlantis a few days ago. His trident managed to slice a gash on his heart. It is a miracle he isn't dead," he stated. "Barry is well, but Nolan completely shattered his kneecap. He'll need quite an advanced surgery and lots of rehabilitation to get back into fighting form," John continued. "Does he not have a healing factor? Should he not be able to heal from that given time?" Cyborg asked from across the table. However, John shook his head. There would need to be bones left for Barry to heal. Nolan completely shattered it, nearly grinding his bone into powder. The surgery he'll undergo is extremely experimental and involves growing new bone from his DNA and grafting it into his skeleton, he explained, and Cyborg nodded in understanding. Diana turned to Batman. "How is Cal doing?" she asked with concern in her voice. Batman grits his teeth. He is still suffering from the prolonged exposure to kryptonite. By the time we had taken the piece out, he was already experiencing massive organ failure. He is currently hibernating in the solar chamber. "I'm not sure when he'll recover." Diana then turned and looked at Hal. "And how have you been, Hal?" she asked sincerely. Hal smiled. "I'm holding up. At least I don't have to use a prosthetic," he said with a humorless laugh as he showed off his new arm that was created by using his ring, but his smile quickly disappeared. "You don't need to worry about me." "I think I got off easy," he said with a somber tone. They were all silent at the meaning of his words. Batman felt them weigh on him most of all. John Hash's dash. "Has Billy been buried and his foster family informed?" he asked, doing well to hold up his facade of indifference. But in actuality, he took the death of Billy the hardest. Not only because he believed all of this to be his fault, but because even if he was just a child, Shazam was the kind of hero that everyone should have aspired to be, and he was a hero till the very end. "Yes, though Miss Marvel has been quite enraged. She's been demanding more information on what happened," John stated. Batman nodded. "Tell her everything she wants to know. Nothing will make a difference now," he replied in a low tone. "I believe it's time to address the elephant in the room." Cyborg said, much to the silence of the others. "There are a lot of spaces that need to be filled, even if only temporarily. Metropolis, Star City and Central have all lost their main protectors. And that's not to mention how the crime will increase with Gotham in its current state. And Arthur was a big part in helping stop human trafficking," he continued. Batman nodded. "Connor will handle Metropolis until Superman recovers or Kara can, but considering her current condition, I don't think that'll be any time soon. With the rest we will have to rely on members of the Junior Justice League and any others that will be able to relocate on short notice," he stated. He then turned to Hal. "How do you think you can contact John and see if he can come back? We could use his assistance at the moment," he asked. Hal sighed but nodded. "I can try, but there's no guarantee he'll be able to," he replied. Batman then stood up. "Things are going to get difficult the next few months. Criminals are going to start to realize that something has happened and will get bolder. Make sure everyone is on high alert and working overtime. I'll pay for any expenses they need," he said to the others, who all nodded in affirmation. "Then this meeting is adjourned," he said before heading out of the room. He walked down the corridors, silently making his way to the living quarters. He opened the door to his own and walked inside. The room was Spartan and barely lived in. You'd think it was unoccupied. Batman walked to the adjoined bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, placing his hands on the sink. He took down his cowl and ran the tap to wash his face. He looked up at his own reflection. The most prominent feature were the bags around his bloodshot eyes. He shouted as he threw his fist through the mirror again and again until his knuckles were bloody. He then put his cowl back on and left the bathroom. Harley found herself waking up in a dry and humid place. She was drowsy and immediately recognized she'd been drugged with something. She tried to stand up but found herself collapsing as she tried. She noticed she wasn't wearing the clothing she had on before, and instead was wearing a satin skirt that covered her front and behind but left her thighs open. She also had a bra with beads running off it. She looked like a belly dancer. "Hey, I bet Marky would love this one," she thought to herself, though she quickly shook those thoughts off as she came to a realization. "That bastard left me again," she shouted as she tried standing up once again, banging her head on the ceiling as she did. "Ow." She moaned as she rubbed her head. She looked up and finally realized that she was in a small cage. Not only that, but there were numerous numbers of cages, and all of them had people in them, ranging from adults to children, men and women. She even saw animals that she'd never seen before, and some that she was pretty sure were extinct. "Is that a Tasmanian tiger?" she thought to herself as she saw the animal lying down in a cage of its own. "That's so cool," she said out loud with wide eyes. "Ugh, Harley, can you please shut the hell up?" a woman in a cage next to her shouted as she threw a pebble that hit her in her forehead. Harley turned around to give this upstart a piece of her mind until she saw who it is. "Oh, Frosty? I haven't seen you in a minute. I thought you were still getting messed by Waller," she said with a manic laugh. Caitlin Snow, aka Killer Frost, an ex-member of the Suicide Squad. She pushed herself up from the floor to her cage and gave Harley an annoyed look. "We don't all have crazy boyfriends that'll break us out, unfortunately," she replied. Harley scowled. "I'll have you know, Buster, that me and Joker are no longer associated," she said as she crossed her arms and stuck out her tongue. Killer Frost sighed. "Whatever," she said before lying back down with her hands behind her head. Harley looked around. "So Frosty, where are we anyway?" "This place is a bit of a shithole," she said as she pushed herself up to her knees. Killer Frost shrugged. "Beats me, I just know it's someplace warm. I barely need to absorb any heat here," she stated. Harley continued looking around until her gaze drifted to the cell next to hers. Inside of it was a girl who looked to be no older than 18. She had shoulder-length black silky hair and was clearly of Asian descent. She was quite short, though Harley couldn't tell how short she was as she had her legs tucked to her chest. "What's her deal?" Harley asks Killer Frost, who shrugs once again. "No clue. Girl hasn't said a word the entire time I've been here. Not even to our captors," she replied. Harley crawled to the side of her cage. She noticed how the girl's eyes followed her as she did. "Hey, I'm Harleen Quinzel, nice to meet ya," she said as she held her hand through the bar to shake the girl's hand, though the girl didn't say anything and made no effort to move to return the gesture. Eventually, Harley huffed rude. She said before sitting back down in her cage. She didn't know how much time passed, but she was getting incredibly bored. "I can't believe Mark left me. He promised he wouldn't," she thought to herself as she stared at the ceiling. "Well, if he thinks I'll let him off easily, he's got another thing coming." "That's right, Buster, Harley is gonna make your life a nightmare once she's free," she said aloud with a sadistic grin on her face. Killer Frost just rolled her eyes listening to Harley seemingly have a conversation with herself. However, they were both snapped out of their thoughts when they heard a door slam. They both sat up and looked ahead to see a group of 3 people walking towards him. Harley immediately snarled as she recognized one of them immediately. "You better watch out, Deathstroke, 'cause I'll kill you once I get out of here," she shouted as she shook the bars to her cage. Deathstroke had no notable reaction other than to chuckle at her before going back to ignoring her. The other 2 men she didn't recognize. One was a tanned man with a beard and receding hairline. He wore an army officer's uniform and had a ceremonial sword at his belt. The other one was a large man in a suit with a square haircut. "As you can see, Colonel Harjofti, we've managed to acquire quite the selection of women. I'm sure a man of your wealth will be looking to the auction," the large man said with a grin on his face. Colonel Harjofti laughed. "Indeed, Mr. Mannheim. You have brought together quite the collection, but if I am honest with you, I am more interested in the arms you've managed to collect. There are very few sources where one can acquire extraterrestrial weaponry," he said as he rubbed his chin. Though he then caught Harley's eye. "However, you do seem to have quite the lovely specimen right here," he said with a lecherous grin. Harley scoffed. "Yeah, right. You'll be a schlong and balls less if you try and touch these goods," she said as she ran her hands down her body. Colonel Harjofti frowned. "Though her attitude could use an adjustment," he said. Mr. Mannheim grinned and took a remote out of his pocket and pressed a button on it. Bzzzt. Harley collapsed to the ground and started shaking as she was being shocked by a device she hadn't realized was around her neck. "Damn bastards," she groaned as Mannheim stopped shocking her and put the remote back in his pocket. "Not to worry, Colonel. All of our products will be suitably trained before we give them to you, unless you wish to train them yourself," that is, Mannheim stated. Colonel Harjofti nodded as his interest was suddenly renewed. "I think I'd like to go and see the weaponry now. As this auction is taking place in my country, I'd like to make sure there is nothing too dangerous," he said with a vile look on his face. The group walked out, slamming the door behind them, leaving Harley and everyone else in the room with minimal light. Harley lay on the floor of her cage as she struggled to move. Her muscles had seized up and she felt numb across her entire body. This wasn't like any electric shock she'd ever felt before, and she'd been tasered a lot. She felt herself drifting back off to sleep, with her last thoughts being on the absolute bastard that left her, though she found that she still wanted to see him again. "You failed, Mark. You are weak and pathetic, a complete disappointment," Nolan shouted as he kicked Mark across the street. Mark coughed up blood as he looked around. The members of the Justice League were all dead around him, with blood and body parts littered everywhere. He then looked back up at Nolan, who had a bloodthirsty grin on his face. In his left hand he had Mark's mother Debbie, and in his right, he had Kara. "You can't protect anyone," he shouted as he crushed his mother's throat with enough power to make her head burst open. Mark started to scream but heard no sound come out of his mouth. He tried to move, but his body felt like it weighed 1,000,000 tons, and it seemed all but impossible. Nolan then pulled Kara close and put both hands on each side of her head. Mark could see the fear in her eyes as Nolan started to squeeze and pull, and a few seconds later he ripped her head straight off her body with her spine still attached. Mark was still screaming, though even now no sound came out. Nolan then approached Mark, kicking him onto his back and mounting him. He then hit Mark in the face with Kara's head. Thud thud thud. Mark is repeatedly beaten with Kara's decapitated head, and he is unable to even raise his arms to defend himself. All he can do is scream. H. Mark opens his eyes and wakes up breathing heavily. He crushes the handles of the medical bed he is in, almost tearing them off as he looks around. His whole body was aching in pain, and his throat felt like he just swallowed a kilo of sand. "Mark, calm down, it's okay," he heard from next to him. He instinctively moved away when he felt someone grab his shoulder, but when he saw who it was he relaxed and felt himself almost cry out in relief. Kara felt tears escape her eyes as Mark woke up, and she couldn't help but hug him tightly. "Something tang," he eagerly returned. "I thought you were dead," she whispered as her tears wet Mark's shoulder. Mark held her tightly, as well as this was the first time he'd seen Kara in a long time, and he was overjoyed. He was also glad he wasn't dead, though when the memories of what happened started rushing in her, couldn't help but feel the situation overwhelm him slightly, and he started to cry as well. Kara rubbed his back. "It's okay. I'm here now," she whispered as she held him closely before getting into bed with him. Mark allowed himself to relax as they held each other. though he was slightly disturbed when he felt someone get into bed behind him, though relaxed slightly as it seemed Kara knew who it was, not now Corey. She whispered loudly, but it seemed Corey didn't listen and joined in on the hugging session, which confused Mark, but a lot of him didn't really care. So he just lay there and enjoyed it. Randall just walked back into his apartment building after it was finally opened again, after the police investigated the explosion that happened on the top floor. Damn crazy, wench, what the hell is that clown playing at, he said to himself as he got into the elevator and pressed the button for his floor. Randall lived in the same building as Harley. She was actually his landlord, and so when he got kicked out of his place by the police department as the top of the building had been taken off, he wasn't very happy. None of the residents were. It didn't help that a lot of the people who lived here were criminals or had active warrants. Randall spent the whole journey in the elevator cursing Harley until the door dinged and opened. As he stepped out onto his floor, he noticed the hallway was pitch black, the only light being the flicking hallway light at the end of the corridor. Splash! Randall frowned as his foot splashed into something as he walked out into the hallway. You gotta be kidding me. A freaking flood and our landlord is AWOL. He almost sent his fist into the wall, he was so mad. Not just the flood, but this entire place stunk badly. If Harley wasn't such a crazy, when she'd definitely give her a piece of his mind, and maybe even his schlong too. As he walked down the hallway to his room, he saw a pale, thin man standing at the end of the hallway just under the flickering light. He wore a large sombrero and had a stereo in one hand. He lifted it up before pressing the button on it. El Jarabe Tapatio. Randall looked at him in confusion as he started playing the Mexican music. He was just about to tell the guy to piss off or there would be trouble before the music abruptly stopped. The flickering light then went out and the hallway was left in complete darkness. Hey! What the hell do you think you're playing at? Randall shouted as he started instinctively backing away as he clenched his fists. Do you like jokes? Ha ha ha. A voice echoed out from the dark, along with a crazy-sounding laughter. I've just come from holiday and heard quite a few good ones. Tell me if you've heard this one before. The voice continued as it started to get closer to Randall. What has 4 legs and 1 arm? He continued. A pit bull in a play area. Ha ha h. The stranger laughed manically as he got closer and closer to Randall. Suddenly the footsteps started to pick up and Randall started to back up faster and faster until he fell over and landed on the ground with a splash. The footsteps suddenly stopped and Randall pushed himself up and tried to find his way back to the lift, but he couldn't see anything. Have a nice trip. The voice said from right behind him, and he felt himself get shoved. Randall tumbled down the stairs, cracking his head, breaking one of his legs, and passing out. When Randall woke up again, his vision was blurry, but when it cleared up he realized he was in his apartment. When he tried to move, he felt a shooting pain come from his hands. Randall started to scream when he realized he'd been nailed to the wall. However, his terror only increased as he saw the man wearing the sombrero who he now recognized. He had a purple suit on and a pale face with green hair and red lipstick with a crazy grin on his face. Now, Mr. Randall, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you about your landlord. Though feel free not to answer straight away. I love myself a challenge, he said, as he pulled a sharp needle out before impaling it into one of Randall's finger joints. Ha. Mark looked outside the window into space, looking at the planet beneath them. It had been a few days since he had woken up, and while he didn't feel fully recovered, he could get up. He's grateful they treated him and saved his vocal cords, as living life as a mute would have been a pain in the butt. He looked over to the bed that Kara was occupying. She had been a lot sleepier lately, which did confuse and concern him quite a bit. His eyes drifted to the growing bump on her belly, and he felt himself start to have another panic attack. Calm down, he thought to himself, and he took a deep breath. This was to be expected, as he had come inside of her more times than he could count. Of course, she'd end up pregnant. While he was freaking out about it, he was kind of excited as well. Kara was an amazing girl, and while it may be a bit sooner than he had planned, he'd be glad to have a baby with her. Mark heard footsteps behind him, and he gulped. There was, however, a new problem Mark was facing, and it was in the form of a 6'4" orange-skinned alien girl that hadn't left his side since he woke up. Greetings, honored one. Are you having trouble sleeping? Is there anything that I can do to assist? She said in a sultry tone as she wrapped her hands around his stomach, grabbing his abs. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine as he felt her breathe on his neck. It was at moments like this he wished he wasn't a Viltrumite. Don't get him wrong, he loved his powers, but right now the only thing going through his head was bending her over the bed and putting his cum in her. It was exactly the feeling he got when he first fought Kara, and their subsequent meeting later on. Honored one. Mark snapped out of his thoughts and turned around, escaping from her grasp. It didn't help she was wearing next to nothing. Listen, Kikari, please stop calling me that. Just call me Mark, he said as he tried holding himself back. She had a pretty blush on her face that made her look even more erotic. He was glad that his injuries had slightly tempered his biological reaction to her, otherwise, he wasn't sure he'd be able to control himself. Corey smiled at him before approaching him again and going to her knees, which made his schlong swell even more than it was before. But you are the honored one. Please allow me to honor you, she said as her hands rubbed against his thighs. Things were getting dangerously close to the point of no return. Mark quickly grabbed her by the throat. Enough, he said firmly as he stared at her, doing his best impression of Nolan in an attempt to intimidate her. Corey moaned as her blush got deeper and she leaned into Mark's grip. She was shaking and Mark could feel his hormones going into overdrive. He sniffed the air and looked down. Did she have an orgasm? He thought to himself, I need to get out of here, he thought before letting go of her throat and walking past her. Where are you going, honored one? Corey said with mild disappointment. Just need some air, Mark replied as he put on a medical dressing gown and some slippers. But we are in space, honored one, Corey said as she placed a finger to her chin. Mark looked back at her for a second, then just sighed before walking through the automatic door. He felt a lot better when he wasn't in a room covered in pheromones, and while he could still somehow smell her, it was a lot better. That was a close one, he said to himself as he walked through the corridors of the watchtower, coming to a section where a large stretch of window ran parallel with the hallway. What was a close one? Mark jumped before he turned and saw that Wonder Woman was next to him. He wasn't really with it today, but how could anyone blame him? The only time he had been in space was when Superman was beating his butt, so it was nice to actually be up here and appreciate the sight. It's nothing, just speaking to myself, he said with a small nervous chuckle. Diana smiled at him and came to stand next to him. I'm glad that you're awake. You've been asleep a lot these past few days, and it has not given me much chance to speak with you, she said. Truth be told, Mark had wanted to speak with her as well. Not her specifically, but any of the JL. Wonder Woman. He said, a little unsure. Please call me Diana, she said, interrupting him with a gentle smile. Mark smiled back. Diana, I wanted to ask if there's any information on where my dad went, he asked. Diana's smile disappeared as a frown marred her face. We haven't been able to track him. We have no clue whether he is on or off planet, she explained, and Mark nodded before looking back out the window to the planet below. Diana puts her hand on Mark's shoulder. Mark, there is so much that I am grateful to you for, she said in a low tone. I have not forgotten how you saved me and foiled Eresia's plot, but more than that, I know it must have been difficult to fight against your father. Truth be told, when I saw you embrace him on the roof, I thought we were doomed, she continued. Even after being chased and nearly killed by us, you still fought against your father for us, and that is a debt we shall never be able to repay, Diana said as she bowed her head slightly. Mark didn't say anything for a while, and Diana just watched as he looked out into space. She then saw him wipe his eyes before turning around to face her. My dad was right, and I'm sure anyone trying to survive in Gotham would happily sacrifice freedom for security. There are so many pieces of shit that make this world a horrible place to live, he said in a cold tone. Diana felt herself getting nervous at his words and the way he looked at her, but there are also a lot of good people, some that helped me even when they didn't have to. It would be downright selfish if I didn't fight for them the same way they did for me, he said before turning back around. Diana found herself in shock, not expecting him to say these things, but before she could reply he spoke again. I need to go back to Gotham. There are people I need to check on. Will that be an issue? He asked. Diana shook her head, so Mark walked past her and continued down the corridor. Diana felt herself sigh as she looked out into space. He would have been such a great hero, she thought to herself. Mark had managed to find some clothing that he could borrow and was in one of the guest rooms getting ready when the doors opened and Kara walked in. I hope you weren't planning on leaving again, she said with a raised eyebrow as she crossed her arms in front of her chest. Mark smiled at her as he pulled his trousers up. He walked up to her before drawing her close and pecking her on the lips. I wouldn't dream of it, he said. Kara grinned at him. Damn right, she said before laying her head on his chest and holding him close. Mark wrapped his arms around her. I have to go to Gotham. I need to check on my mum and a few others. You can come with if you want, he told her, and she nodded her head. Mark was content to enjoy the hug a while longer, but curiosity got the better of him. Hey Kara. Corey didn't follow you, right? He asked with slight concern in his voice. She removed her chest from his head and looked around before his gaze stopped to the left of them. She's in the mess hall right now, why? She asked. Mark raised an eyebrow at her as he went and sat down on the bed. I'm sure you've noticed how she's been acting the past few days, he said. Kara rolled her eyes. Don't mind her, it's nothing personal, she just seems to have a strange fixation on your race as they used to be protectors for hers or something, she explained. Mark nodded in understanding. Well, try and keep her away from me. It's getting a lot harder to control my impulses when she's practically gushing, he told her with exasperation. Kara raised her eyebrows in surprise. Is it like with? Mark nodded. Yeah, it's the same way I felt when I was with you. Though I'm guessing she has a better handle on it than I do. Kara sighed. I'll talk to her, she simply said, which earned her a grateful smile from Mark. However, a devious grin appeared on Kara's face, and she started slowly approaching Mark, who was on the bed. I bet you considered it though, she whispered as she pushed Mark down on the bed and straddled his hips. Mark laughed nervously. I don't know what you're talking about, he said as Kara placed her hands on either side of his head. You know, leaving me for so long had me so frustrated I considered doing it too, she said as she leaned down and whispered in his ear before biting it. Mark's hands found their way to her hips, and then he found himself flipping up the skirt of her costume and putting his hands on her tight little cheeks. Kara moaned into his neck as she sucked on it. She ground her core onto Mark's growing schlong. Kara stopped kissing his neck and looked him in the eyes. Her cheeks were hot, and her eyes were fluttering. I want you so badly. Ever since you got me pregnant, it's like I'm wet all the time. You better take responsibility, she whispered. Mark grabbed her by the back of her head and pulled her face to his, pressing his lips to her own and slipping his tongue into her mouth. Their tongues wrestled in each other's mouths, and Mark ended up pushing Kara onto the bed as he climbed on top of her. They both embraced each other as they came down from their shaboinking high. Mark sighed as he wanted to fall asleep with her, but he did need to leave. Come on, Kara, we need to get going, Mark said as he slipped out from next to her. However, instead of getting up, she curled up on his bed and just pulled the blanket over himself. Mark chuckled. I guess I'm going alone then, he said to himself as he put on the rest of his clothes and left the room. He nearly jumped out of his skin when outside the room Batman stood like a statue. As Mark stared at him, he couldn't help but wonder why he wasn't more angry. It was cause of the man before him that he had to leave his home, but as he stared at Batman and saw how shit he looked, he found that he honestly didn't care much anymore. We need to talk, he said in a gruff tone. Mark sighed. You have until I reach the nearest airlock, he said as he walked past him. He didn't need to turn around to know that he was being followed. For a while neither of them said anything, and instead just walked through the corridors of the watchtower until finally, Batman spoke. I was wrong. I let my paranoia get the better of me, and the result of which has almost left us broken, he said. Mark could tell that his words were real and heartfelt. There was one question that burned in Mark's mind. Ever since he found out what happened to his dad, he stopped walking and turned to face Batman. My mom knew what happened to my dad. You even had a deal, so tell me, why did you leave me and my mom to fend for ourselves in Gotham, he said as he looked at Batman. You could have groomed me to be a hero when my powers came in, yet you just left us to suffer, he said with a large amount of resentment in his voice. You're right. I shouldn't have left you and your mother. I know how bad Gotham can be better than anyone. In truth, I did not want you to become a hero. It ran the risk of you encountering your father. I just hoped you'd never get your powers and lead a regular life, Batman explained. Mark felt his blood start to boil as he clenched his fists. He wanted to smash the man's face into the wall. But he let it go, turned around, and continued walking through the corridor. We need your help, Mark, he heard Batman say from behind him. Mark stopped and turned around, looking at Batman incredulously. He then started laughing. You think I'd help you, bastard, with anything after what you guys did? With Superman, Flash, Aquaman, and Shazam out of commission, villains are going to be coming out of hiding. We need everyone we can get, Batman continued. Mark went to rebuff him once again, but didn't get the chance. I know you don't want to be a hero, Mark. So how much? I'm sorry. Whatever you got paid by the Triad in Gotham, I'll double it for every job you do for me, Batman stated. Mark couldn't help but be dumbfounded. He must be desperate if he's resorting to this, Mark thought to himself. And while his first instinct was to tell him to go F himself, he did have to consider what the hell he'd do for money now that he wasn't on the run. He didn't exactly want to go back to a life of crime, but he still wanted to get his mom out of Gotham. 50,000 a job more depending on the threat, Mark said, bluntly. Done. I'll keep in touch. I'll make sure you're compensated for your fight with Nolan as well, Batman said before turning around and skulking off. UGH finally. Why he left US stinking for weeks, Harley shouted up at the balcony where guards were stationed. She and all the other captives had been led to a communal showering area where they could clean themselves. It was the first time in who knows how long Harley had gotten to shower, and it was great even if the water wasn't as hot as she'd liked. Seeing the sheer amount of people that were being held captive, as well as the large amounts of different products, it finally clued Harley in to where they were. She had never been herself, but everyone important in the criminal world knew about the underworld auction, a place where you could buy damn near anything for the right price, even people. Back when she still ran with Joker, he'd often talked about robbing the place, but he never went through with it. Only an idiot would try and steal anything from here. Not only is it protected by the alien military, but it's also protected and run by Intergang, and you don't want them on your tail. Needless to say, Harley was quite pissed off as it meant escaping was going to be a lot harder than she thought. Don't worry there, Cassie, we will get out of here no problem. Harley said as she rubbed soap into her body. Cassandra just looked at her, not saying a word, as she also made use of the shower. Harley had decided that since Killer Frost was a bit of a wench, she'd be best friends with Cassandra instead. Or at least that's what the captors called her. "I'm not a wench," Killer Frost said as she showered opposite them. "Oh, did I say that out loud?" Harley said as she turned her head in mild confusion. Killer Frost muttered something she couldn't hear before going back to showering. "Hey, Harley, I bet you didn't expect to see me here," a woman said from behind her. Harley turned around and saw an auburn-haired woman who was nearly 7 foot tall. She had huge breasts and a large amount of muscle on her frame. "Giganta? I thought I left you for dead," Harley said with a dumbfounded look. Giganta clenched her fists and gritted her teeth. "You did. And now I'm gonna do the same," she said as she made her way towards Harley, reaching out to grab her. But before she could, Cassandra grabbed her hand and bent it toward her before kicking her knee. She flipped over onto her back, and Cassandra slammed her knee down on her chest before punching her in the throat and incapacitating her. It all happened so quickly, so when Harley finally had time to process it, a large smile grew on her face, and she started jumping for joy. "My new friend is so cool," she shouted as she ran over and grabbed Cass in her arms, holding her tightly. Mark flew out of the airlock after his long and quite frankly annoying conversation with Batman, though he cleared that from his mind for now and started flying back towards the Earth. As much as he enjoyed the feeling of floating in space, there were people he worried about and others he needed to check on. At the top of that list was Waylon. While he didn't have much hope for him being alive due to how easily his dad disregarded human life, he did have a small spark of hope. Waylon had saved Marks, but from being robbed and murdered more times than he can count. He's the reason he even managed to beat Nolan in the first place. Without him, Mark would bet he'd be halfway to the Viltrum home planet by now. He felt his heart tighten and feel overwhelmed with guilt at the thought of Waylon dying. It hadn't felt real before, but as he flew closer and closer, the real weight of what had happened started to weigh on him. He sped through the sky, making his way to Gotham. It didn't take him long to get there, and when he did, everything became real and not just some horrible dream. He felt his breathing start to get ragged as he floated in the air. Down below him was Gotham, but so much of it was destroyed. At the time, he thought he had done his best to reduce the damage to his surroundings, but it seemed he was wrong. Lots of buildings were partially collapsed and roads were ripped up. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Mark found himself clenching his fists as he looked down to a certain road where the blood still stained it even a fortnight later. Mark shot off towards his mom's house. He couldn't just let himself stay there feeling guilty. He'd always been a person of actions rather than words, so if he felt like this, then he'd do something about it. But first, he'd check on those closest to him and make sure they weren't caught in the crossfire. Flying over the city, he saw lots of buildings that had collapsed being excavated by the fire department in conjunction with different construction companies. He could see bodies being pulled out of the rubble, and he looked away, focusing on flying to his mom's house. Flying to his bedroom window, he carefully opened it and slipped in. It hadn't been that long since he had been in here. Not even a year, but it sure as hell seemed to, considering what had happened in such a short time. His room was clean, a lot cleaner than he ever kept it. Though I suppose his mom had thought he was dead, so she'd at least want to keep his things undisturbed. He walked to his bed and sat down. On his bedside cabinet was a picture of him. Mom and Dad when he was younger. It was their first holiday together that he could remember. Mark lifted his hand and grabbed the picture of the cabinet, looking at it and sighing. For a moment he just looked at it, remembering all he could about that moment in time. Eventually, he put it back on his cabinet, though he left it face down. It was just then that the door to his room opened and his mom walked in with a pistol raised in his direction, which isn't that unexpected when you live in Gotham and think someone might have broken in. "Stand up slowly and put your hands up," Debbie shouted as she pointed the gun at Mark. "Mom, it's me," Mark said as he turned around and looked at her with a small smile. Debbie gasped as she put her hand to her mouth while her other still pointed the gun at Mark shakily. Tears started to form in her eyes as she looked at her son, the one that should be dead. Debbie had seen the news coverage of Superman punching a hole through her son and him being thrown into the sea. "Sea can't be real. You're just my imagination," she whispered out as she backed up out of the room into the hallway. It had been a difficult few months for Debbie. Losing her son had been like a gut punch, and did weeks she didn't even leave her room and barely ate. She'd considered ending it all, as what did she have to live for? She'd lost her husband and her son. Mark stood up from the bed and walked around in front of it. "It's me, Mom," he said softly as he reached out and took the gun from her before dropping it to the ground. Debbie launched herself at Mark, hugging him tightly as she wept. She held him as if he might disappear forever, as she still wasn't sure whether this was all a dream or not. "Please tell me you're real," she said desperately as she gripped him tightly. She started sobbing even louder, making Mark return the hug as he rubbed her back. "I'm real, Mom. And I'm back home, he said reassuringly. And that's how they stayed for a while. Debbie cries tears of sadness, of joy, of relief all at once. Mark held her the whole time as he comforted her. He had missed his mom so much, and if it wasn't for the fact that he needed to comfort her, he would be crying as well. With everything that had happened with him being on the run to then facing his dad, he was just glad he was home now. You stupid, 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 Debbie said as she slapped Mark's shoulder with a pillow she'd gotten from the sofa. After she had calmed down from the shock of seeing Mark, they sat down and Mark answered all the questions she had. Mark answered them all and explained where he had been the past months. What made Debbie start hitting Mark was when he mentioned that he had gotten Kara pregnant. Stupid boy. I'm too young to be a grandmother, she said as she kept throwing things at him that Mark caught and put down. Mom, wait. There's a good explanation, I promise, he said just before catching the TV remote that was aimed at his head. After she calmed down a bit, Mark explained to her that after his Viltrumite powers came in, it gave him a hormonal imbalance that is normal for his race as there are so few of them. They're driven to mate with the best candidates. After the conversation, she calmed down and instead just smiled. So when do I get to meet my future daughter-in-law, she asked. Mark smiled sheepishly. Well, I'm sure she's busy, so tomorrow? Very good, I'll make sure to cook something nice. She can eat human food, right? Debbie said as she stood up from the sofa. Mark's eyes widened. Mom, wait, I won't be able to come tomorrow, he said as he followed her into the kitchen and watched her look through the cabinets. There is still something I haven't told you yet, about Dad, he told her. This stopped Debbie, and she just stood there with her hands on the kitchen cabinet. The fight between the Justice League and Nolan had only been covered slightly, so Debbie had known that he'd come back, though she wasn't sure what had happened after, as there were lots of conflicting rumors and the news helicopter crashed at some point before the end. After Dad beat the League. I was the one who fought him, he said in a low tone as he placed his hand on his mom's back. I tried to kill him. But he's alive, he said. He misses you, Mark said to her. Debbie started to cry once more. Everything was so complicated, but at least she had her son back. Despite what she'd heard about what Nolan did, she still loved him, and she missed him as well. For the second time that day, she broke down and cried in her son's arms. Mark flew across Gotham. He was heading back towards Wayne Tower, as it was in that area that Waylon had saved him from getting taken by his dad. He kept on getting sidetracked, however, as he had discovered a pocket of people trapped in the basement of a collapsed building. Luckily, they seemed to have had a supply of food and water, otherwise they'd be dead. Mark ripped his sleeve off and made a makeshift mask with it as he flew down to the rubble. It didn't take long for him to dig down to the basement with his super strength as well as gravity powers. He didn't much like the attention he was getting from the people he'd saved nor the firemen who thanked him, but he was glad he could help them. He saw himself as partially responsible for what happened to Gotham, and so this helped relieve the guilt he felt a bit. After helping a few more trapped people, Mark shot off again and landed on the street where Waylon had joined the fight. He could see the sewer grate he had used as well as the building he'd most likely been thrown through. A lot to the area was cordoned off and hadn't even been cleaned. There were a large amount of blood stains on the floor, which led into the building that had a massive hole inside of it. While Mark was sure he wasn't allowed in here, he knew no one would question a person who was currently floating above the ground. Mark flew through the hole and made it to the area where Waylon most likely landed. At first he thought perhaps he was dead and his body was carted away, but his eye caught a trail leading away from the area. Mark followed it and felt hopeful as he saw it lead down to a sewer grate. He quickly dashed towards it and ripped it open before flying down. The trail was harder to follow down here, but Waylon seemed to be bleeding a lot, and it managed to dry even in such a damp place. Flying through the sewer tunnels, Mark turned a corner and felt his hope shatter into dust. He landed on the ground and started walking. He walked straight until he came to the large-scaled body of his friend. He was face down on the ground, seemingly having succumbed to his injuries. Mark felt incredible amounts of rage and sadness overwhelm him. He slammed his fist into the wall, which cracked it and shook the whole tunnel as he screamed. He knelt by his friend. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve to die here alone, he said with tears pouring down his face. Waylon was a good guy, a lot better than most other people in Gotham, and a lot better than someone with his condition should have been. Mark sat by the wall next to his friend for a while. Something he'd do with Waylon from time to time, only this time there wouldn't be another. Mark finally got up. I won't leave you here, he said as he pulled him by the arm and put his body over his shoulder. He started floating again and flying right out of the sewer. Mark flew out of Gotham to a hill with a large tree. He conjured a red sphere with his hand and quickly used it to make a hole in the ground before putting Waylon inside of it. He filled it in and then got a large stone that he put at the back of the grave. I hope I'll get to see you again one day, Mark said as he finished carving the message into the gravestone. He stood there a few more minutes before flying away. Here lies Waylon Jones' patron for the lost friend Nolan groaned once again as he downed a whole bottle of painkillers. His eyes were bloodshot and his fists were clenched. His entire right side was bandaged, but blood could still be seen soaking it. He sat in a small cheap house in Mexico where he was currently hiding. His first thought was to get in communication with Viltrum, but he changed his mind. He was too injured at the moment, and if he made contact with them they would undoubtedly send Conquest or Anissa, which were two people he couldn't deal with unless he was at full strength. As angry as he was that he had lost his fight, he couldn't help the smile that stretched on his face as he thought about how strong his son was. A true hybrid hasn't been seen in thousands of years, he thought to himself as he considered the implications of Mark's existence. He'd seen how powerful Thrag was as a true Viltrumite/Tamaranian hybrid. Having the power to absorb solar radiation not only enhanced his already considerable power, but as he aged the more he stored. His body was essentially a budding star, and even Viltrumite scientists did not know how long he'd live or how powerful he'd become. Perhaps Mark will be the same, Nolan thought to himself as he reached to his right side, remembering his final attack. He didn't even feel any resistance. As soon as his arm came into contact with the sphere, it was disintegrated or erased from existence. Once he healed, he'd have to find a replacement arm to get back into fighting shape, though who knows where I'll find a decent prosthetic in such a low-tech world, he thought as he stroked his chin. His mind drifted back to his time as a hero and his different encounters with villains. If he wanted a prosthetic that would be able to keep up with him, he could seek out Lex Luthor and force him to do it, though he didn't trust the man not to build a few tricks into it. He also was reluctant to get one made of Terran technology, which left one more option in Turgang, he thought to himself with a smirk. Papa. Papa. Nolan turned around to see a 14-year-old boy coming inside with a woman. Look, Papa. The boy said as he pushed himself off the ground and started floating. Nolan stood up from the table with a smile on his face. Mi amor. We must change your bandages, the woman said as she put down her bag of shopping. I am fine, Anna. It is time to celebrate. Oliver here has finally come into his powers, and so early as well, Nolan said with excitement as he patted Oliver on the back. Can I finally help you, Papa? Like you said, he said with excitement. Nolan smiled. Of course we will start your training tomorrow, he said, much to Oliver's excitement. Mark was sitting on a building in Gotham drinking from a bottle of vodka, though he doubted he'd get drunk. He would try. Though as he sipped on the bottle and held it in front of him, he had a bit of a realization. Shit, Harley.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going. Plus, it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.